Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. The icy October wind blew through the faded tarps of the Shooting Star Circus, making them snap like the sails of a ghost ship. It was 1931, and the Great Depression had turned America into a graveyard of dreams. Between the shadows of the empty stands, Thomas laughed. Murphy was adjusting his makeup in front of a cracked mirror, his trembling fingers sliding red lipstick over lips that no longer knew how to smile naturally. The makeshift dressing room was a small wagon decorated with yellowed photographs of better times. In each one, Thomas smiled genuinely, surrounded by crowds who still had reason to laugh. Now, at 45, his wrinkles were deepening under the white paint, like furrows dug by time and sadness. "Are you still performing tonight, Tom?" asked Sarah, the young trapeze artist, leaning against the carriage door. Her green eyes carried the same concern that everyone in the circus shared. Thomas was more than a clown. He was the beating heart of the Shooting Star. Even if that heart was getting weaker and weaker. "The show can't stop, darling," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "People need a few laughs more than ever." His gaze met hers through the mirror, and for a moment, Sarah saw beyond the mask. She saw the man who carried the weight of making others smile while his own soul shattered. The Shooting Star Circus had once been one of the biggest in the American Midwest. Now, it was just another traveling attraction struggling to survive. The grandstands, once packed, could barely hold a few dozen spectators. People had bigger problems than spending their last dime on entertainment. Frank Miller, the circus owner, a burly man with a poorly trimmed mustache, entered the wagon without knocking. "Murphy, we need to talk about the numbers," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of financial worries. "We can't go on like this." Thomas continued applying his makeup as if he hadn't heard. He knew that conversation well. It was the same one that had destroyed so many other circuses in recent years. "Frank, do you remember what you told me when you hired me? A clown isn't just a performer, he's a doctor of the soul." Frank sighed, running his hand over his tired face. "That was 20 years ago, Tom. The world was different. People were different." "This sadness is the same," replied Thomas, standing up. His colorful suit contrasted with the gloomy atmosphere of the wagon, perhaps even greater now. "That's why we need to keep going." Sarah watched the scene in silence, her hands clenching nervously at the hem of her tracksuit bottoms. She had grown up in the circus, and Thomas was like a father to her. Watching him struggle to keep alive not only the spectacle, but the very essence of what it meant to bring joy, broke her heart. Outside, the small town of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, stretched out like a mosaic of hopelessness. Rows of unemployed people snaked through the streets, and for sale signs decorated the facades of once thriving stores. It was against this backdrop that Thomas laughed. Murphy had made a silent promise to keep making people laugh, no matter what the cost. "I have an idea," said Thomas, his eyes shining with an intensity Sarah hadn't seen for months. "What if we gave free performances to the children at the orphanage? Think about it, Frank. We might not make any money, but we'll make something more valuable. Hearts." Frank shook his head, but there was a trace of a smile on his lips. "You've always been an idealist, Murphy. That's why I haven't sent you away yet." Night was beginning to fall, and the first stars were appearing in the Iowa sky. Thomas approached the mirror one last time, adjusting his red nose. In the reflection, for a brief moment, he swore he saw something different, a younger version of himself, smiling with a joy he had long since lost. "You know," he said, turning to Sarah and Frank, "they say a clown never really dies. We keep making people laugh, even after we're gone." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. "Don't talk like that, Tom. You still have a lot of shows ahead of you." Thomas smiled, but there was something different in his gaze, a mixture of determination and melancholy that seemed to transcend the present moment. "Of course, darling. and I promise that as long as there's a single mirror in this world, I'll keep bringing smiles." The circus canvas snapped again in the wind, and the lights began to come on one by one. In a few minutes, albeit to a small audience, Thomas laughed Murphy would be on stage once again. Little did he know that this promise, made in a moment of emotion, would echo through the decades in a way that no one could have predicted. The distant sound of children laughing reached the wagon, and Thomas felt his heart warm. Maybe Frank was right. The world had changed, but as long as there were people who needed a smile, there would be room for a clown who took his mission as seriously as his own life. "It's time," he announced, adjusting his colorful hat. "Let's make these people forget their troubles, if only for a few minutes." As Thomas walked towards the arena, Sarah couldn't help but notice how his shadow seemed to dance on the walls of the wagon, as if it had a life of its own. It was only the beginning of a story that would mix laughter and mystery, joy and melancholy, in a dance that would continue far beyond that night in October 1931. The night wore on as Thomas made his way to the arena, his footsteps echoing through the dimly lit passageway. The familiar smell of sawdust and candies mingled with the cold October air. His thoughts wandered between memories of the golden days of the circus and the harsh reality they now faced. As Thomas approached the curtain that separated the backstage area from the arena, he heard the few voices that made up the audience that night. Among them, he distinguished the crystal-clear sound of children's laughter, the children from the local orphanage who had received free tickets. Their little faces lit up with anticipation were all the fuel he needed. Sarah watched from afar, her heart squeezing as she saw Thomas adjust his posture, like a soldier preparing for battle. This was how he viewed each performance, a sacred mission to bring light to the darkness that had settled in people's hearts during the Great Depression. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host's voice sounded tired, but still trying to maintain the grandeur of yesteryear. "With you, the legend of the Shooting Star Circus, the man who brings smiles to even the darkest nights, Thomas laughed Murphy." The clown walked through the curtain with his characteristic comic stagger, but something was different that night. His movements, although as precise as ever, seemed to carry an extra weight, a shadow that only the most attentive could notice. The performance began like so many others. The usual antics, the jokes he had told hundreds of times, the tricks that made the children squeal with delight. But there was a different intensity to his performance, as if every gesture, every expression, was a declaration of love for his art. Between acts, Thomas noticed a little girl in the front row. Her large, attentive eyes followed him with a mixture of fascination and sadness that he recognized immediately. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. During a pause, he approached her, pulling a colorful scarf seemingly out of nowhere. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice gentle behind the painted smile. "Lucy," she answered shyly, "from St. Vincent's Orphanage." Thomas turned the handkerchief into a paper flower, his nimble fingers dancing in the air. "You know, Lucy, sometimes life can seem a bit sad," he said, handing her the flower, "but there's always magic hidden in the most unlikely places." The girl held the flower as if it were a precious treasure, and her smile lit up the whole arena. At that moment, Thomas felt a pang in his chest, a painful reminder of his own mortality that had become more frequent in recent months. Frank watched from the backstage entrance, his financial worries momentarily forgotten in the face of the magic he was witnessing. He knew Thomas wasn't well. The doctors had been clear about his heart condition, but seeing him there, turning sadness into joy, was a reminder of why the Shooting Star Circus was still going. The show went on, and Thomas seemed to get better by the minute. His jokes were sharper, his movements more graceful, as if he were channeling a lifetime of experience into a single evening. The audience's laughter echoed through the tent, louder and more genuine than it had been in months. Sarah noticed that the shadows cast by Thomas on the tent walls seemed to have a life of their own, dancing in an almost supernatural way. It was as if multiple versions of him were performing simultaneously, each carrying a different facet of his personality. Towards the end of the show, Thomas prepared for his favorite act, the mirror trick. With a theatrical gesture, he revealed a full-length mirror in the center of the arena. The object, an old circus relic, looked mysterious under the colored lights. "You see," he announced to the audience, "sometimes it's not what's in front of the mirror that matters, but what it reflects in our hearts." As he stood in front of the mirror, something strange happened. For a brief moment, his reflection seemed to move independently, as if it were a separate entity. Some children gasped, but most interpreted it as part of the show. Lucy, still holding her paper flower, leaned forward in her seat, her eyes wide with fascination. She was the only one who noticed when Thomas gently touched the mirror and whispered something that sounded like a promise. The end of the performance was met with enthusiastic applause. Not many people, but their affection was genuine. Thomas took his final bow, his smile brighter than ever, even if his legs trembled slightly under the weight of the effort. Backstage, Sarah rushed over to help him. "Tom, you looked amazing today," she said, noticing how he leaned heavily on her shoulder. "Just doing my job, darling," he replied, his breathing a little wheezy. "Just reminding people that there's still magic in the world." Frank approached, carrying an envelope. "Murphy, about that idea of free performances. Maybe we could try it. You tried something today?" Thomas smiled, but his eyes were fixed on the mirror that was still in the arena, reflecting the lights that were beginning to fade. For a moment, everyone present swore they saw something strange in the reflection, as if multiple smiles were hovering on the silver surface. "You know," said Thomas, his voice carrying a different tone, "they say that every great artist leaves a bit of their soul in every performance. Maybe that's true in more ways than we realize." The night was beginning to say goodbye, and with it, something in the air seemed to change. The shadows on the circus walls danced with a life of their own, and the mirrors in the dressing room caught reflections that shouldn't have been there. It was as if Thomas's promise to keep bringing smiles was already beginning to take shape in ways that no one could have predicted. That same evening, after the show, Thomas remained at the circus long after everyone had left. Sitting in his dressing room, he gazed at his reflection in the cracked mirror, slowly removing the makeup that had become his second skin over the years. "It's funny," he muttered to himself, "how a painted face can hide so many truths." His fingers trembled more than usual as he wiped away the last trace of white paint. The mirror now revealed not only his tired face, but also shadows that seemed to move on their own in the corners of the reflection. Sarah had insisted on staying with him, worried about his condition after the extraordinary performance, but Thomas had kindly refused her company. "Some conversations," he said with an enigmatic smile, "we need to have only with our own reflection." The autumn wind continued its melancholy dance around the circus, making the tarpaulins moan like ancient beached whales. Thomas picked up a worn photo album that he kept in a drawer, his private collection of memories of the shooting star. Each page told a different story. Each image captured a moment of joy that now seemed to belong to another life. As he leafed through the album, one photograph in particular caught his eye. It was from his first circus performance 20 years ago. Young Thomas was smiling genuinely at the camera, his eyes shining with hope and determination. But there was something strange about the image. In the shadows behind him, there seemed to be another smile, one that he was sure hadn't been there when the picture was taken. "Curious," he whispered, bringing the photograph closer to his face. The smile in the shadows seemed to wink at him, like a distant star in the night sky. A sudden noise made him look up. In the dressing room mirror, his reflection didn't follow the movement. For a moment that seemed to span eternity, Thomas observed his own image smiling back at him, regardless of his expressions. "So that's how it's going to be?" he asked his reflection, his voice calm despite the extraordinary nature of the situation. The Thomas in the mirror only widened his smile, his eyes carrying all the joy that the real Thomas had lost over the years. Outside the carriage, little Lucy, who had hidden after the show, watched in fascination through a crack in the window. She watched as Thomas stood up and touched the mirror with his fingertips, and as his reflection made the same gesture, but with an almost imperceptible delay. "I always knew there was something magical about you, Mr. Murphy," she whispered to herself, clutching the paper flower he had given her against her chest. Thomas felt her presence and turned to the window, but Lucy had already disappeared into the darkness. What remained was a strange feeling that something fundamental had changed that night, as if the real world and the world of reflections had begun to mix in unpredictable ways. Picking up his old makeup case, Thomas began to organize his belongings with special care. Each item had its own story. The red nose his mentor had given him, the broken comb he'd been using for decades, the magic handkerchief that always kept tricks up its sleeve. "You know," he said to his reflection in the mirror, who was now watching him with an expression of understanding, "I always wondered if it was me who made people laugh, or if it was something bigger through me." The reflection tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. The shadows in the carriage seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, dancing on the walls like silent spectators of a singular conversation. Thomas felt that twinge in his chest again, stronger this time. His heart, that old companion of so many performances, seemed to want to tell him something. He sat down heavily in his chair, taking a deep breath as drops of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "Not yet," he muttered, as much to himself as to his reflection. "I still have promises to keep." In the photo album open on the table, the pictures seemed to take on a new dimension. In each of them, in the shadows and in the less noticeable corners, mysterious smiles began to appear, as if the past was being rewritten before his eyes. The wind outside increased in intensity, and with it came the distant sound of laughter. Not the laughter of the present, but echoes of all the joys Thomas had provided throughout his career. It was as if the circus itself was alive, breathing memories and exuding magic. Sarah, who had decided to go back to check on her friend one last time, stopped at the wagon door when she heard Thomas talking. But when she looked out of the window, she saw only him sitting alone, smiling at his own reflection, as if sharing an intimate secret with a younger, happier version of himself. "Tom," she called softly, knocking on the door. "Is everything all right?" "Never better, darling," he replied, without looking away from the mirror. "Just finding out that some shows never really end." Thomas's words carried a weight that Sarah couldn't fully comprehend, but which made her heart clench with a mixture of love and concern. She knew, somehow instinctively, that she was witnessing the beginning of something both wonderful and melancholy. Dawn crept in as Sarah stood at the entrance to the carriage, watching Thomas through the crack in the door. Something in the atmosphere had changed. The air seemed denser, charged with an invisible electricity that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Sarah, darling," Thomas's voice sounded different, as if it had come from a long way away. "Do you remember the first time you saw me perform?" She entered the carriage, taking a seat next to him. "Of course I do. I was only 6 years old. You made a balloon elephant that looked real. I swore I was going to start walking any minute." Thomas smiled, his eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the mirror. "The magic isn't in the tricks, you know. It's in the eyes of the beholder, in the will to believe that there is something extraordinary in the world." The wind outside had turned into a peculiar symphony, mixing the creaks of the canvas with whispers that seemed to carry distant laughter. The photographs scattered on the table seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, each image telling its own silent story. Lucy, who had sneaked back into the circus, watched everything from the wagon window. Her childlike eyes, not yet limited by the bonds of adult disbelief, caught details that others couldn't see, like the shadows that danced independently of the light, or the smiles that appeared and disappeared in the reflections. "Tom," Sarah held her old friend's hand, noticing how cold it was. "Maybe we should call a doctor." "There's no need," he replied, his voice surprisingly firm. "Tonight is not about endings, but about new beginnings." Frank appeared at the wagon door, his normally stern face marked by genuine concern. "Murphy, we found this in the old circus archives," he said, handing Thomas a yellowed envelope. Inside the envelope was a photograph even older than the others. It showed the Shooting Star Circus in its early days, decades before Thomas joined the troupe. But there, in the shadows of the tent, was a familiar smile, a face that looked impossibly similar to his own. "Extraordinary, isn't it?" Thomas laughed softly. "It feels like I've always been here, in one form or another." Sarah and Frank exchanged worried glances, but before they could say anything, a sound of childish laughter filled the air. Lucy had finally plucked up the courage to enter the carriage, still clutching her paper flower. "Mr. Murphy," she said, her voice small but determined, "are you really going to keep making people smile forever?" Thomas knelt in front of her, his movements slow but graceful. "You know, Lucy, there are different ways of being present. Sometimes we're in the smiles we leave behind, in the memories we plant in people's hearts." The wagon lights flickered on, and for a moment everyone swore they saw multiple reflections of Thomas in the mirrors, each from a different era, each carrying a unique smile. It was as if time had folded in on itself, allowing different versions of him to coexist in the same space. "Frank," Thomas turned to the circus owner, "promise you'll keep the shooting star alive, not for the profits, but for what it represents, a place where magic is still possible." Frank, normally so pragmatic, felt tears forming in his eyes. "You have my word, Murphy. This place will always be a sanctuary for dreamers." Sarah realized that something fundamental was changing. The shadows in the carriage had begun to move more pronouncedly, as if responding to a song that only they could hear. Thomas's reflection in the main mirror was smiling with a vivacity that contrasted with his increasingly serene expression. "Lucy," Thomas called out to the girl again. "You can see it, can't you? The smiles in the shadows, the stories in the photographs." The girl nodded, her eyes shining with understanding. "They've always been there, haven't they? Waiting to continue the show." Thomas smiled, a smile as genuine as those in his older photographs. "Exactly. And now, my dear, I must prepare for my next performance." He stood up, walking over to the main mirror. His reflection awaited him, no longer as a simple image, but as a doorway to something beyond ordinary comprehension. The photographs scattered around the wagon seemed to vibrate with an energy of their own, each smile captured on paper beginning to come to life. Sarah wanted to stop him, to grab his arm and keep him there, but something in her heart knew that this moment was inevitable and perhaps necessary. Frank remained silent, witness to a transformation that defied all logic. "A clown never really dies," said Thomas, his voice mixing with the wind that blew through the circus. "He just finds new stages, new ways to bring joy." When he touched the surface of the mirror, it wasn't his reflection he found, but a portal to all the laughter that was yet to come, all the joy that still needed to be shared. Lucy smiled, being the only one who truly understood what was happening. The magic wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new phase. The wind blew stronger, bringing with it the echo of all the past and future performances of the Shooting Star Circus. And on that extraordinary night, while the world outside continued its struggle against the Great Depression, something wonderful and inexplicable happened in a small circus wagon in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. A clown was fulfilling his last and most important promise. The next morning, the news spread quickly through the small town of Cedar Rapids. Thomas laughed. Murphy had left during the night, but the circumstances of his departure generated more whispers and speculation than sadness. The wagon where he had spent his last hours was exactly as it had been left. Old photographs scattered on the table, his clown costume carefully folded on the chair, and the main mirror reflecting the dawn light in a peculiarly vivid way. Sarah was the first to enter the carriage that morning, her eyes still red from a bad night's sleep. The air inside the small space felt different, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The photographs on the table had changed subtly. In each one, Thomas's smile seemed more alive, more present. "He's really done it, hasn't he?" Lucy appeared in the doorway, still holding her paper flower, now a little crumpled but still magical. "He's found a way to keep making people smile." Frank arrived soon after, carrying the morning papers. The headlines talked about the economic crisis, about banks closing and families losing everything, but on the inside pages, a small note caught the eye. Circo Estrella announces free performances for underprivileged children. "That's what he wanted," said Frank, his voice hoarse with emotion. "To keep the magic alive, especially for those who need it most." The days that followed brought subtle changes to the Shooting Star Circus. People began to notice strange things, reflections that seemed to move on their own, laughter that echoed when no one was around, and above all, the mysterious smiles that appeared in old and new photographs. Sarah took on the responsibility of organizing Thomas's belongings, but every time she tried to put his things away, something inexplicable happened. The photographs returned to the table, as if they wanted to continue telling their stories. The main mirror refused to be covered. Any cloth placed over it would mysteriously fall off during the night. Lucy began to spend more time at the circus, especially in the old wagon. She talked to the reflections as if they were old friends, and sometimes the other performers swore. You could hear answers in the laughter the wind brought. "Look," she exclaimed one afternoon, pointing to a new photograph of the circus. In the image, taken during a recent performance, Thomas's characteristic smile could be clearly seen in the shadows of the stairs. News of this extraordinary occurrence spread, first as a whisper among the performers, then as an urban legend throughout the city. People started coming to the circus, not just for the shows, but in the hope of capturing in their own photographs a glimpse of the legendary clown who had promised never to stop making people smile. The most remarkable thing was how Thomas's presence seemed strongest during the moments of greatest joy. When the children laughed, the mirrors in the circus reflected multiple smiles. When someone took a photograph of a particularly happy moment, it was almost certain that a familiar smile would appear in the shadows of the image. Frank, initially skeptical, began to notice changes in himself. The financial worries, although still present, seemed less burdensome. He found himself smiling more often, especially when he passed Thomas's carriage, where the main mirror continued to reflect much more than just images. "It's as if he's found a way to turn all the sadness into something beautiful," Sarah commented one evening, observing how the circus lights danced differently, creating patterns that resembled smiles on the tent walls. The Great Depression continued outside, but inside the Shooting Star Circus, something magical was happening. Free performances for underprivileged children had become a tradition, and with them, stories about a clown who appeared in reflections, bringing smiles at the most unlikely moments. Lucy, who had become a sort of unofficial guardian of Thomas's legacy, began collecting stories from people who swore they had seen him. Each account was different, but they all shared a common element: the feeling that, even in the darkest moments, there was room for a smile. "He taught us that the real magic is in how we choose to see the world," she said one day, organizing her growing collection of mysterious photographs. "Sometimes you have to look through the reflections to find the truth." The Shooting Star Circus didn't just survive the Great Depression. It flourished, becoming a beacon of hope in difficult times. People came not just for the entertainment, but for the chance to experience something truly magical. And so the story of Thomas Laugh Murphy continued, not as a sad legend, but as a constant reminder that joy can find its way through the most unlikely of circumstances. His smile, multiplied infinitely through reflections and photographs, became a symbol of resistance against the darkness of the times. On the quietest nights, when the wind blew through the circus tarpaulins, you could still hear the echo of his laughter, mixed with the thousands of others he had inspired over the years. His last act had not been an end, but a beginning, the start of a new form of magic that would continue to touch hearts and inspire smiles for generations. And in every mirror, in every photograph old or new, in every moment of genuine joy, Thomas Laugh Murphy continued to fulfill his promise, proving that some stories never really end. They just find new ways to be told, new hearts to touch, and new smiles to inspire. The icy wind blew across the plains of Pine Ridge, carrying with it the ancestral lament that echoed in the memories of the Lakota people. Sarah Swift Eagle, a 17-year-old girl, watched the orange horizon of dusk as her grandfather, Joseph Sacred Cloud, prepared the sacred pipe for the evening ceremony. The sweet aroma of traditional tobacco mingled with the sage that burned slowly beside them. "Grandpa, tell me again about White Buffalo Calf Woman," Sarah asked, her dark eyes reflecting the same curiosity she had as a child. Joseph smiled, the wrinkles on his face telling stories of many winters lived as he adjusted his traditional blanket over his shoulders. "A long time ago, when our people were going through great hardship, 2 young warriors went out hunting, he began, his deep voice carrying the weight of the story. On their journey, they met a beautiful woman dressed in white, who was carrying a sacred package. One of the warriors had impure thoughts about her and was turned to dust. The other, respectful, was spared and instructed to return to the village to prepare his people for her arrival. Sarah knew the story by heart, but each time she heard it, new details seemed to emerge, like water flowing from an ancient spring. The reserve was facing difficult times. Drought was punishing the land, traditions were being lost among the young people, and poverty was growing like weeds in fertile soil. The signs are everywhere, Joseph continued, pointing to a group of clouds forming in the sky. The prophecies speak of his return in times of great need, when the people need to find their way back to harmony. At school, Sarah faced the daily challenge of balancing 2 worlds, that of Lakota traditions and that of modern society. Her classmates often mocked her beliefs, especially Tommy Redfeather, who had completely abandoned traditional customs in favor of the dominant culture. The community was divided. Some, like his Aunt Martha Crescent Moon, insisted that salvation would come through modernization and the abandonment of old superstitions. Others, like her grandfather, remained steadfast in preserving ancestral teachings. That night, as the moon rose in the starry sky, a group gathered in the community center to discuss the growing crisis in the reserve. The drought had destroyed most of the crops, and government resources were scarce. Sarah watched from the doorway as voices rose in disagreement. "We have to accept the mining company's proposal," argued Martha, her gray hair tied up in a tight bun. "They've offered jobs, money to the community. We can't live on old dreams and stories." Joseph stood up slowly, the sacred pipe in his hands. "What we were taught by White Buffalo Calf Woman are not just stories." His voice was calm but firm. "They're the foundations of who we are. The land is not something we can sell or trade. It is our sacred responsibility." Sarah felt the weight of the conflict in her heart. Her best friend, Lisa Chavasuave, had lost her father to alcoholism the year before, a disease that affected many on the reservation. The old stories spoke of healing and harmony, but how could they help with such modern and complex problems? During the meeting, an elder called David Swifthorse shared a vision he had had. "I saw a white buffalo in the hills," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. And it wasn't alone. It was followed by other buffalo, bringing life back to the dry grasslands. Some laughed quietly, others listened reverently. Sarah, however, felt something different, a deep connection with the elder's words. She remembered the strange dreams she had been having over the last few weeks. Visions of buffalo running under a stormy sky and a mysterious woman who seemed to be calling her. After the meeting, while helping her grandfather put away the sacred objects, Sarah shared her dreams with him. Joseph listened attentively, his eyes shining with ancient knowledge. "Dreams are messages, little one," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "White Buffalo Calf Woman didn't just teach us rituals and prayers. She showed us that everything is connected, the past, the present, and the future. The problems we face today are no different from those our ancestors faced. The solution has always been to maintain balance." That night, lying in her bed, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. Through the window, she could see the stars shining brightly in the dark sky. A gentle wind entered the room, bringing with it the scent of sage and prairie grass. In her mind, her grandfather's words mingled with the old stories and modern problems of the reservation. Before falling asleep, Sarah had a strong feeling that something important was about to happen. The prophecy spoke of White Buffalo Calf Woman returning in times of need, and these were certainly difficult times. But how would she recognize the signs? And more importantly, how could she help her people find their way back to the harmony they so desperately needed? Sleep slowly enveloped her, and in her dreams she once again saw a buffalo running free across the plains. This time, however, they weren't just distant visions. They seemed more real, closer, as if they were crossing the border between the world of dreams and reality. And in front of them, glistening like the first snow of winter, ran a white buffalo. The next morning brought with it a dense fog that covered Pine Ridge like a protective cloak. Sarah woke up still feeling the vivid effects of her dream about the buffalo. As she got ready for school, she noticed something different in the air, a peculiar silence that seemed charged with expectation. At breakfast, his mother, Helen Gentle Wind, was preparing traditional corn fritters, the comforting aroma filling the small kitchen. "You seem distant today," Helen observed, noticing her daughter's pensive gaze. Sarah hesitated before sharing her dreams, knowing that her mother, although respectful of traditions, was more pragmatic than her grandfather. "I've had strange dreams, Mom, about buffalo and something else I can't quite explain." Helen stopped what she was doing, her hands suspended over the dough. For a moment, Sarah saw something flash through her mother's eyes. Recognition, perhaps concern. "Your grandmother had dreams like that," Helen said softly, returning to her work. Before she left, she talked a lot about signs and visions. "Your grandfather believed her, but I was too young to understand." At school, Sarah met Lisa Soft Rain in the corridor. Her friend seemed more excited than usual, her eyes shining with restrained excitement. "You won't believe it," whispered Lisa, pulling Sarah into a corner. "My Uncle Robert saw something strange in the hills last night. He says there were lights dancing over the prairies, just like the old stories said." Before they could continue the conversation, Tommy Red Feather walked past them, purposely bumping into Sarah. "Still believing in fairy tales, Swift Eagle?" he teased, a mocking smile on his face. But Sarah noticed something different in his eyes, a shade of unease that didn't match his usual arrogance. During history class, while the teacher was discussing the colonization of the American West, Sarah couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts wandered to the stories her grandfather told about White Buffalo Calf Woman, about how she had appeared in a time of great need. The reservation was certainly going through hard times right now. At lunch break, a group of students gathered in the courtyard, commenting on strange events that had been happening. Ginny Ivers Kalmas, a senior, said that her father, one of the tribal counselors, had found mysterious footprints near the dry creek. Footprints too large to be those of any known animal in the area. Sarah was observing the discussion when she noticed Tommy sitting alone under a tree. Something in his solitary posture made her approach him, putting aside her resentment of the previous provocations. "Is everything all right?" she asked, taking a seat next to him. Tommy remained silent for a moment, playing with a beaded bracelet that Sarah had never noticed before. "My grandmother passed away last week," he finally said, his voice low and vulnerable. "Before she left, she gave me this." He held out the bracelet. It was beautifully handcrafted with traditional Lakota patterns. "She said that times of change were coming and that I would need to remember who I am." Tommy's confession took Sarah by surprise. Beneath his facade of modernity and disdain for old ways, there was a connection to his roots that he tried to deny. "You know," Sarah said gently, "my grandfather always says that our traditions are not chains that bind us to the past, but roots that give us the strength to grow." After school, Sarah decided to visit the Reserve's Cultural Center, where her Aunt Martha worked. She found her organizing documents about the mining company's proposal, her face tense with worry. "Sarah, dear," Martha smiled tiredly, "have you come help me with the paperwork?" "Actually, Annie, I came to ask about Grandma. Mom mentioned something about her having special dreams." Martha put the papers aside, a faraway look in her eyes. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman. She saw things that others couldn't. Before the great flood of '97, she dreamt of rising waters. No one believed her, but she insisted that we prepare shelters. It saved many lives." While Martha was talking, Sarah noticed movement through the window. A group of elders were gathering in the community center, including her grandfather and David Fasthorse. There was an urgency in their movements that caught her attention. "Something's happening," murmured Martha, also observing. "The elders don't get together like this for no reason." Sarah said goodbye to her aunt and ran to the community center. Through the ajar door, she could hear voices arguing in Lakota. Her grandfather noticed her presence and beckoned her in. "The signs are multiplying," said David Swifthorse, his voice shaking with emotion. "Not just the lights on the hills and the mysterious footprints. The birds are returning to the dry grasslands, and this morning we found green shoots where nothing had grown for months." Joseph picked up the sacred pipe, his movements deliberate and precise. White Buffalo Calf Woman taught us that renewal comes through connection, with the land, with each other, with our ancestors. Perhaps it's time to bring the people together for a great ceremony. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The elder's words echoed her own feelings, visions, and dreams. Something was changing on Pine Ridge, something that went beyond disputes over mining or modernization. It was as if the land itself was awakening from a long sleep. At nightfall, as he walked home with his grandfather, the wind began to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, bringing with them the distant smell of rain, an aroma almost forgotten in the parched prairies. "The times of change have come, little one," said Joseph, watching the sky. "And you, like your grandmother before you, have an important role to play." Sarah looked up at the approaching clouds, feeling the weight of her grandfather's words. In her mind, the buffaloes of her dreams kept running, and now they seemed closer than ever. The storm forming on the horizon finally reached Pine Ridge, bringing with it some long-awaited rain. Sarah watched the drops through her bedroom window, while listening to the excited voices of the neighbors celebrating outside. It was as if nature itself was responding to the recent events on the reservation. The next morning, the earth exuded that unique scent of rain and wet soil. Sarah found her grandfather in the yard, examining small green shoots that had sprung up during the night. "It's as if the earth is waking up," he said, gently touching one of the tender leaves. At school, the buzz was constant. The unexpected rain had brought hope, and even the most skeptical were beginning to question recent events. Tommy, who normally kept his distance from Sarah, approached her during break time. "My grandmother used to say that when rain comes after a long drought, it's a sign that the spirits are watching," he said, his voice low and hesitant. Sarah noticed that he was still wearing the beaded bracelet, now more visible on his wrist. Lisa joined them, bringing even more intriguing news. "Did you hear? They found huge footprints near the old stream, where the water started flowing again. And they're not just the footprints of an animal. They seem to form a pattern, as if they were dancing." The news spread quickly through the reserve. After school, a sizable group of people gathered near the stream. Sarah accompanied her grandfather there, watching as the elders examined the mysterious marks in the damp soil. "These are the same ones that appear in the old stories," murmured David Swifthorse, kneeling down to touch the prints. "The sacred patterns that White Buffalo Calf Woman taught our people." Aunt Martha was also present, her usual skepticism giving way to an expression of astonishment. "This can't be the work of vandals or bromists," she admitted, studying the intricate markings. "No one knows these patterns in such detail, except those who have kept the ancient teachings," Joseph added, exchanging a meaningful glance with the other elders. That evening, the tribal council called an emergency meeting. The room was packed, with people of all ages and different views on the traditions. Sarah noticed that even those who normally avoided traditional events were present. "The mining company has increased its offer," Martha announced, presenting new documents. "They know about the rain and the signs, and they're afraid we'll lose interest in the deal." A murmur went through the room. Joseph stood up slowly, carrying the sacred pipe. "Our ancestors taught us that land is not something we can sell. What we are witnessing are the signs that were prophesied. White Buffalo Calf Woman is reminding us of our true wealth." To everyone's surprise, Tommy stood up. His voice trembled slightly, but his words were firm. "My grandmother told me, before she left, that we would see signs of renewal. She said we would need to choose between following the path of money or the path of ancient wisdom." Sarah felt her heart racing. Her dreams of the buffalo were becoming more vivid every night, and now she was beginning to understand their meaning. They were not just symbols of the past, but messages for the present and future. The discussion went on into the night, with different voices and opinions being expressed. Some still defended the mining company's proposal, arguing that the money could bring practical improvements to the community. Others, inspired by recent events, spoke of returning to traditional farming and conservation practices. While the adults debated, Sarah noticed a group of young people gathered outside. Lisa, Tommy, and other teenagers were talking quietly, sharing their own experiences of recent dreams and visions. "It's like something is calling us back," said Jenny Calmwaters. "Yesterday, I dreamed about my great-grandmother, who I've never met. She was dancing with buffalo under a starry sky." The group decided to form a youth circle to study ancient traditions. Tommy, to everyone's amazement, offered his house for the meetings. "My grandmother left a lot of books and articles about her culture. I think it's time to really get to know them." Sarah shared her dreams with the group, describing the buffalo and the sense of urgency she felt. Everyone had their own story to tell, their own connections to the past that were beginning to awaken. Meanwhile, at the adults' meeting, an important decision was being made. The tribal council voted unanimously to postpone any decision on the mining company's proposal until the signs had been properly interpreted and understood. "Our young people are showing the way," declared David Swiftforce, observing the group gathered outside. "They are the bridge between the old and the new." Joseph smiled as he saw his granddaughter at the center of the circle of young people, her voice clear and confident as she shared the stories he had taught her. "White Buffalo Calf Woman showed us that renewal comes through generations," he said. "The cycle continues." The night progressed, and with it, more rain clouds approached. The air was charged not only with humidity, but with possibilities. Something was changing in Pine Ridge, something that went beyond earthly disputes and everyday worries. Sarah felt a gentle breeze touch her face, carrying with it the scent of sage and wet grass. In her mind, the buffalo continued their eternal dance across the prairies, but now she was no longer alone in her vision. Others were also beginning to see, to dream, to remember. The ancient prophecy spoke of a time of renewal, when White Buffalo Calf Woman would return to lead her people back to harmony. As she watched the raindrops begin to fall again, Sarah realized that perhaps this time would not be a one-off moment, but a gradual awakening, a return to the wisdom that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. The rain continued for several days, transforming the arid landscape of Pine Ridge. The streams began to flow again, and the prairies began to show shades of green that had not been seen for a long time. The group of young people led by Sarah continued to meet regularly at Tommy's house, where the old stories took on new life through their voices. At one of these meetings, while they were studying the meanings of the sacred symbols, Lisa arrived breathless with some surprising news. "You have to see this," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. "There's a group of wild buffalo in the northern hills." The news spread like wildfire through the reserve. Buffalo hadn't been seen in the area for decades. Joseph and the other elders organized an expedition to check it out, and Sarah insisted on accompanying them. Tommy, overcoming his earlier hesitation, also offered to go. At dawn, the small group set off towards the hills. The air was fresh and clean after the rains, and the rising sun painted the sky in vibrant colors. As they walked, Joseph shared stories about how his ancestors lived in harmony with the buffalo. Every part of the buffalo had a sacred purpose, he explained, not just for food, but for tools, clothing, shelter. They taught us about not wasting, about respecting life in all its forms. After a few hours of walking, David the swift horse signaled for the group to stop. In the valley below, grazing peacefully, was a small herd of buffalo. Sarah felt her heart race. The scene was just like in her dreams. "Look," whispered Tommy, pointing to something moving among the animals. A young buffalo, its pure white coat shining in the morning sun, stood out from the rest of the herd. The silence that followed was deep and reverent. Joseph lit the sacred pipe, blowing smoke in all four directions. "It's no coincidence," he said softly. "The signs are coming together." Back at the reserve, the news of the buffalo, and especially the white buffalo, caused quite a stir. Martha called an emergency meeting of the tribal council, but this time the tone was different. Instead of discussing the mining company's proposal, the conversation centered on how to protect the land where the buffalo had returned. "We can't ignore the significance of this," she declared, surprising everyone with her change of position. "Maybe it's time to reconsider our priorities." The young people in the study group began organizing story-sharing sessions with the younger children in the community. Sarah watched with pride as Tommy, once so resistant to traditions, enthusiastically taught them about the meanings of sacred symbols. Lisa brought her grandmother to one of the meetings, a lady who had rarely left the house since the death of her son. The old woman cried when she saw the young people so interested in the ancient traditions. "It's as if the circle is closing," she said, her trembling hands holding Lisa's. One day, while Sarah was helping her grandfather prepare medicinal herbs, he shared something he had kept for a long time. "Your grandmother had a vision before she left," he revealed. "She saw young people gathered in a circle, bringing new life to old forms. She saw a girl, you, Sarah, serving as a bridge between the worlds." The revelation touched Sarah deeply. Her recent dreams had become clearer, showing not just the buffalo, but scenes of healing and renewal for her community. She shared these visions with the youth group, and together they began to plan concrete actions to help the reserve. They started a community garden project, using traditional cultivation methods that Joseph and other elders had taught them. Tommy surprised everyone by using his knowledge of technology to document the ancient techniques, creating a digital archive of oral traditions with the permission of the elders. The presence of the buffalo in the hills attracted the attention of the media and conservation groups. Reporters started showing up at the reserve, interested in the story of the return of the sacred animals. Sarah and her friends saw this as an opportunity to share their culture in a respectful and authentic way. "It's not just about the buffalo coming back," Sarah explained to a journalist. "It's about remembering who we are and finding a way to live in harmony with the land again." The mining company tried one last time to influence the community's decision by offering an even larger sum. But something had fundamentally changed in Pine Ridge. The tribal council, with the unanimous support of the community, definitively rejected the proposal. "Our wealth is not in what we can extract from the land," Martha declared during the vote, "but in how we can live in balance with it, as we were taught." One evening, as the group of young people gathered around a campfire, sharing stories and dreams, Sarah realized that something bigger was happening. It wasn't just about preserving the past, but about creating a future that honored both ancient traditions and the needs of the present. "White Buffalo Calf Woman taught us that renewal comes through connection," she told the group. "Maybe that's what we're experiencing now. Not just the return of something old, but the birth of something new." The white buffalo continued to be seen in the hills, as a constant reminder of the sacred presence that guided their people. And with each passing day, more signs of renewal appeared on Pine Ridge, not only in the land that was once again flourishing, but in the hearts and minds of its people who were rediscovering their ancestral strength and wisdom. The transformation of Pine Ridge continued in a subtle but profound way. The community gardens flourished under the dedicated care of young people and elders working side by side. Sarah noticed how the project had become more than just growing food. It was a living symbol of the renewal her community was experiencing. Tommy, who once mocked traditions, now led workshops on green technology, combining ancestral knowledge with modern, sustainable solutions. His project to digitally document oral histories had grown, attracting interest from other reserves and even universities. "It's amazing how much everything has changed," Lisa commented as she helped Sarah harvest medicinal herbs. "Remember when we thought we had to choose between being modern or traditional? Now I see that we can be both." The herd of buffalo in the hills had become permanently established, and the white buffalo continued to be seen regularly as a silent guardian of the land. Researchers who came to study the phenomenon were intrigued not only by the unlikely return of the animals, but also by the ecological revitalization that accompanied them. Joseph began organizing regular walks with the young people to a safe observation point where they could see the buffalo and learn about their cultural and ecological importance. "Each buffalo is like a prayer in motion," he explained. "Their feet work the earth, their mouths spread seeds, their dung nourishes the soil. They teach us about the sacred cycle of life." News of Pine Ridge's transformation began to spread. Other indigenous communities sent representatives to learn about how the reservation had managed to balance tradition and progress. Sarah and her friends often found themselves sharing their experiences with curious visitors. Martha, who had previously fiercely defended modernization at any cost, became one of the most vocal advocates of the community's new path. She worked tirelessly to establish partnerships with environmental conservation and sustainable development organizations. I realized I was looking for solutions in the wrong places, she confessed during a council meeting. The real strength has always been here, in our own wisdom. One day, while Sarah was walking alone through the now green prairies, she found familiar footprints, the same mysterious marks that had appeared months before. Following them, she came to a small clearing where a white buffalo grazed serenely. For a moment, their eyes met, and Sarah felt a deep connection with something greater than herself. That evening, during a special ceremony, David Swiftwars shared a new vision. "I saw our young people leading the way for other communities," he said, his voice charged with emotion. "What's happening here is just the beginning." The youth study group had grown into a larger movement. They began organizing cultural festivals that attracted people from all over, celebrating not only Lakota traditions, but also finding ways to apply them to contemporary challenges. "It's like White Buffalo Calf Woman is showing us a new way," Sarah reflected during one of these celebrations. "Not just to go back to the past, but to create a future that honors all aspects of who we are." The community began to thrive in unexpected ways. Traditional knowledge about medicinal plants, combined with sustainable cultivation practices, led to the development of an herbal cooperative that generated income for families. The young people found ways to use technology to preserve and share ancestral knowledge, creating bridges between worlds that had previously seemed irreconcilable. Tommy, who had become one of the most dedicated scholars of the traditions, often said, "My grandmother was right about the choice we had to make, but it wasn't between money and tradition. It was between remaining divided or finding our own way of healing." The changes at Pine Ridge have not gone unnoticed by the outside world. Journalists, researchers, and environmental activists began visiting the reserve, interested in learning how a community had managed to turn a crisis into an opportunity for renewal. Sarah, now recognized as a young leader in her community, often found herself explaining to visitors that the real miracle was not in the extraordinary events that had occurred, but in the way people had chosen to respond to them. "White Buffalo Calf Woman taught us that everything is connected," she said. "When we remember this, we begin to see that the healing of our land, our community, and ourselves are all parts of the same journey." The white buffalo continued to appear in the hills, no longer as an omen of change, but as a constant reminder of the path they had chosen. The children of the reserve grew up hearing not only the old stories, but also witnessing how these stories were given new life through the actions of their community. One quiet afternoon, as Sarah and her grandfather watched the sun set over the revitalized prairies, Joseph smiled with satisfaction. "White Buffalo Calf Woman promised to return in times of need," he said. "Perhaps a return was not a single event, but something that happens whenever we choose to remember who we really are." Sarah nodded, finally understanding the true meaning of her dreams and visions. The renewal that White Buffalo Calf Woman had prophesied was not just a return to the past, but an awakening to a new way of being, one that honored the old traditions while embracing the possibilities of the present. The prairies of Pine Ridge continued to flourish, and with them, the hope of a future where old wisdoms and new ways could coexist in harmony. The Lakota people had rediscovered their strength, not only in the stories of the past, but in the courage to create their own history, one chapter at a time. The Harrison family's old mirror had remained untouched in the attic for decades. Sarah, a 16-year-old teenager, had always felt an inexplicable attraction to that object covered in a weathered sheet. That autumn afternoon, while organizing some boxes at her mother's request, her fingers brushed against the dusty fabric that concealed the Victorian mirror. "Don't touch that," warned Emily, her best friend, who was helping her with the cleaning. "My grandmother always said that old mirrors hold stories that are best not awakened." Sarah rolled her eyes, but couldn't hold back a shiver when an icy breath blew through the attic, making the floorboards creak. "Do you really believe in such superstitions? It's just an old mirror." "It's not just any mirror," said Emily, approaching cautiously. "They say it belonged to Mary Sullivan. That woman who mysteriously disappeared in the 50s? Have you ever heard the story? Sarah nodded, her curiosity piqued. The attic, lit only by the dim light coming in through a small circular window, seemed the perfect setting for supernatural stories. Emily sat down in an old rocking chair, which protested with a high-pitched groan. Mary was a young widow who lived alone in the house next door. People said she practiced strange rituals after she lost her young son in an accident. One night, neighbors heard screams coming from her house. When the police arrived, they found only this mirror with scratch marks on the glass. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but remained skeptical. And how did this mirror get here? Her grandmother bought Mary's house at an auction, along with some furniture. This mirror was one of them. Emily lowered her voice. They say that if you look closely, you can see dark stains that look like dried blood. At that moment, thunder echoed in the distance, making the two girls jump. The approaching storm cast unsettling shadows across the attic, bringing the covered shapes of the old furniture to life. "Had you ever heard of the Bloody Mary ritual?" asked Emily, her voice almost a whisper. Sarah nodded, who hadn't heard that urban legend. "Well, some people believe that this mirror is especially receptive to that kind of invocation." Sarah laughed nervously, trying to disguise her discomfort. "Don't tell me you want to try." "Of course not," Emily replied quickly. "But today is October 31st, Halloween. If there's ever a time for scary stories, this is it." The rain began to fall outside, its drops drumming on the roof like restless fingers. Sarah found herself staring at the covered mirror, wondering what could be hiding under that dusty sheet. "My mother tells me that her grandmother used to have terrible nightmares after she brought that mirror home," Emily continued. "She used to say that she saw a woman in a white dress stained with blood standing at the foot of the bed, always pointing to the attic." Sarah felt her heart race. The story was stirring her more than she'd like to admit. Why didn't anyone ever get rid of him? "They tried," Emily replied, leaning forward. 3 times. Each time, the mirror mysteriously returned to the attic the next morning. A new clap of thunder, closer now, made the lights flicker. For an instant, Sarah swore she saw a movement reflected in the small piece of the mirror that was exposed where the sheet had slipped. "Let's go downstairs," suggested Emily, standing up abruptly. "It's getting late, and your mother asked us to finish before nightfall." But Sarah remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the mirror. There was something hypnotic about it, something that called to her. Without realizing it, she took a step forward, her fingers reaching for the sheet. "Sarah." Emily tried to stop her, but it was too late. The fabric slid smoothly away, revealing the mirror in all its dark glory. The frame was adorned with intricate carvings of rose bushes, their flowers and thorns so detailed that they looked real. The glass, although dulled by time, still reflected their images with disturbing clarity. And it was then that Sarah noticed. There were 3 reflections in the mirror, not 2. A pale, hazy figure hovered behind them, its form undefined but undeniably feminine. For an instant that seemed like an eternity, no one moved. The air in the attic became dense, charged with an ancient, malevolent energy. Emily was the first to react, pulling Sarah tightly by the arm. The two stumbled down the stairs, closing the attic door with a bang. Gasping, they looked at each other in the second-floor corridor. Did you see it?" Emily stammered, her face pale as wax. Sarah nodded slowly, unable to form words. Her mind tried to rationalize what she had just witnessed, but there was no logical explanation for that third figure in the reflection. That night, lying in her bed, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the mirror and its mysteries. The storm continued outside, and each flash of lightning seemed to illuminate shadows that shouldn't have been there. In her head, a voice whispered tantalizingly, 3 times? To say my name 3 times? What Sarah didn't know was that encounter in the attic had triggered a series of events that would change her life forever. Mary Sullivan's mirror held darker secrets than any urban legend could suggest. And now that it had been discovered, it would not rest until it had completed its purpose. Halloween night was just beginning, and with it, a horror story that had spanned generations was about to repeat itself. Sarah Harrison had inadvertently opened a door to a world of shadows and distorted reflections, and now she would have to face the consequences of her curiosity. Sarah spent the night tossing and turning in bed as the storm continued outside. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that hazy figure in the mirror, its shadowy presence etched into her memory. His cell phone vibrated on the bedside table. It was a message from Emily. "I can't sleep. I keep thinking about what we saw. We need to do more research on Mary Sullivan." Sarah agreed, feeling a mixture of fear and curiosity consume her. She turned on her laptop and started digging through old archives of the local newspaper available in the city's digital library. Emily was right. There was more to the story. The records showed that Mary Sullivan wasn't just a lonely widow. Before her disappearance, she had become a controversial figure in the community. Several people reported unexplained events in her presence, and some even accused her of practicing witchcraft. The most disturbing was the account of her last day, October 31st, 1952. According to the report, neighbors heard Mary reciting something repeatedly before the screams. When the police broke down the door, they found only the mirror in the living room, with nail marks on the glass and drops of blood on the floor. The body was never found. The light in Sarah's room flickered, startling her. In the reflection of the computer screen, for an instant, she swore she saw a pale face watching her. Turning quickly in her chair, she found only her empty room and the dancing shadows caused by the lightning. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a backache from falling asleep in her chair. The sun shone timidly through the clouds that still covered the sky, as if the storm of the night before had never existed. Emily arrived early, carrying a pile of old books. "I found these in my grandfather's library," she explained, spreading the volumes out on Sarah's bed. "They're books about local folklore and the town's history. There are a few mentions of Mary Sullivan and other similar cases." The girls spent the morning immersed in the yellowed pages. They discovered that, before Mary, there had been other mysterious disappearances in the region, all connected in some way to antique mirrors. In each case, the victims reported seeing a woman in a white dress in their reflections days before they disappeared. "Look at this." Emily pointed to a particularly interesting page. According to this legend, antique mirrors can serve as portals to the other side, but they need to be fed. "Fed?" Sarah asked, feeling a chill. "With souls," Emily replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Legend has it that spirits trapped between worlds use mirrors to attract victims. Each soul captured makes them stronger." A noise from the attic interrupted the conversation. The two looked at each other, paralyzed. It was as if something was dragging on the floor above them. "It's probably just the house cracking," Sarah tried to rationalize, but her voice sounded unsure. "Sarah," Emily hesitated, "don't you think it's strange that your family never got rid of that mirror? As if something was stopping them." The question hung in the air, heavy as lead. Sarah thought of all the times her mother avoided talking about the attic, how her grandmother always kept the door locked, how no one in the family liked to go up there. "We need to find out more about what happened to Mary," Sarah decided, "and about how she got that mirror in the first place." The girls decided to visit Mary Sullivan's old house, now occupied by an elderly couple. Mrs. Peters, the current resident, greeted them with curiosity when they mentioned Mary's name. "Oh, that poor woman," sighed Mrs. Peters, pouring tea. "My husband and I found some of her things in the basement when we moved in. Letters, diaries. We never had the heart to throw them away." Sarah and Emily exchanged excited glances. Mrs. Peters went upstairs to collect the documents, leaving the girls in the old room. On the walls, several decorative mirrors reflected the afternoon light. "Don't you think there are too many mirrors in here?" Emily whispered uneasily. Before Sarah could answer, Mrs. Peters returned with a dusty box. Among the yellowed papers, they found what appeared to be Mary Sullivan's diary. The last entries were disturbing. "The mirror is calling me again, stronger and stronger. It promises to give me back my Thomas. It says I can see him on the other side, but the price is too high." Sarah felt her heart race as she read those words. Thomas was the name of the son Mary had lost. According to the diary, she had bought the mirror from a mysterious antique dealer who had shown up on her doorstep a few days after the boy's funeral. There's something else here, Emily murmured, pulling a yellowed envelope from the bottom of the box. Inside, a black and white photograph showed Mary Sullivan standing next to the infamous mirror. But what caught the girl's attention was the reflection caught in the glass. Where Mary's image should have been, there was only a dark, distorted silhouette. The sound of breaking glass upstairs made the three women jump. Mrs. Peters went upstairs to check, leaving Sarah and Emily alone with their disturbing discoveries. "Sarah," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, "look at all those mirrors in the living room. Don't you think they look different now?" Sarah observed the reflections around her. On each mirrored surface, the shadows seemed denser, deeper than they should be, and in each of them, there was a subtle movement, as if something or someone was watching. Mrs. Peters didn't return. The minutes dragged by while Sarah and Emily remained paralyzed in the room, surrounded by increasingly disturbing reflections. The silence was absolute, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. "We need to check that she's all right," Sarah whispered, slowly getting up. Emily grabbed her arm. "We mustn't separate," she replied, her eyes fixed on the mirrors that seemed to pulsate with an energy of their own. Together, they climbed the creaking staircase. In the corridor on the second floor, shards of glass glittered on the floor. One of the mirrors had shattered inexplicably, but there was no sign of Mrs. Peters. "Mrs. Peters?" called Sarah, her voice trembling. No answer. In every room they checked, they found more mirrors, some covered by sheets, others exposed, all emanating an aura of malevolence that made their hearts race. "Sarah, look at this." Emily pointed to an ajar door at the end of the corridor. It was a small office, its walls covered in yellowed newspaper clippings. As they approached, they realized that they were all about mysterious disappearances over the decades. "They weren't just stories," Emily muttered, studying the clippings. "It's happened before. Many times." A pattern began to emerge. Each disappearance was connected to old mirrors, and they all occurred in 7-year cycles. The last documented case was that of Mary Sullivan in 1952. "Wait," Sarah calculated mentally. "If the pattern continues, this year, it's the next cycle," Emily added, her face pale. A loud thud from upstairs startled them both. It was coming from the attic. Sarah held tightly to Mary's diary, which she still carried, feeling that its pages held crucial answers. Determined to find Mrs. Peters, they went up to the attic. The door was ajar, a dim light escaping through the crack. As they entered, their eyes took a while to adjust to the dimness. The attic was a labyrinth of old mirrors, all uncovered, their reflections multiplying the space infinitely. In the center, on a round table, there was an open book and a candle that had almost been consumed. "It's a grimoire," Emily whispered, approaching the book. "Look at these notes. They're rituals for communicating with the other side." Sarah flipped through Mary's diary, looking for connections. The last few pages revealed a frightening truth. Mary hadn't simply disappeared. She had discovered a ritual to bring her son back, using the mirrors as portals. "She wasn't the first," Sarah read aloud. "The mirror. It travels from person to person, promising to fulfill their deepest desires. But it's a trap." A movement in the reflections caught her eye. For an instant, all the mirrored surfaces showed the same image. A woman in a white dress, stained with blood, holding the hand of a small child. "Thomas," an ethereal voice echoed through the attic. "Is that you, my son?" The girl slowly turned around. Mrs. Peters was standing in the doorway, but there was something wrong with her gaze. It was empty, glazed. "She's possessed," Emily whispered, stepping back. "No," Sarah realized, "it's Mary. She's never left this house. She's in all the mirrors." The figure of Mrs. Peters advanced mechanically, her hands outstretched. "I need my son. I need to complete the ritual." Sarah flipped frantically through the diary, looking for answers. The pages revealed that Mary had discovered how to use the mirrors to create a network of portals, each fed by the life energy of its victims. "The mirror in your house," Emily said, understanding. "It's not just a portal. It's the original. The first one." The temperature in the attic plummeted. In the reflections, shadows began to move independently, forming distorted silhouettes that contorted and reached towards them. "We need to destroy it," Sarah declared, clutching the diary to her chest. "It's the only way to free them all." But when they tried to move towards the door, they found that they were surrounded. In each mirror, a different version of Mary Sullivan watched them, some crying, others smiling malevolently. "No one leaves," Mrs. Peters/Mary's voice echoed. "Not until the ritual is complete." Sarah realized that it was no coincidence that they had found the mirror in the attic of her house, just as it was no coincidence that they were there at that moment, discovering the truth. The mirror had planned everything, patiently waiting for the right moment to complete its macabre cycle. The candle on the table flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. In each reflection, the images began to distort, revealing glimpses of another world, a place of darkness and despair where lost souls wandered eternally. "There's something in the diary," Emily said, flipping through the pages quickly. "A counter-ritual." Mary tried to undo what she had started, but she couldn't complete it. The words were interrupted by a high-pitched scream. Mrs. Peters had collapsed, her body writhing on the floor as a dark mist emanated from her eyes and mouth. The mirrors began to vibrate, their surfaces rippling like water. Sarah and Emily found themselves at a crucial moment, surrounded by distorted reflections and a supernatural force that had waited decades for this moment. Whatever they did next would determine not only their fates, but also that of all the souls trapped between the mirror worlds. And at the center of it all, the original mirror waited in its attic, its blackened surface pulsing with an ancient and evil energy, ready to claim its next victims. Sarah gripped the diary with renewed strength, her eyes frantically scrolling through the pages as Emily tried to help Mrs. Peters. The dark mist emanating from the unconscious woman began to take shape in the air, revealing silhouettes that danced like living shadows. "Here," exclaimed Sarah, her finger trembling over a stained page. Mary discovered that the original mirror needs to be destroyed at a specific time, when the veil between the worlds is at its thinnest. "Midnight on Halloween," Emily added, understanding. Exactly when Mary disappeared, the antique clock downstairs began to chime, its chimes echoing through the house like a dark omen. It was only 2 hours to midnight. "But there's more," Sarah continued reading. "The ritual needs to be performed by someone who shares a connection with the mirror, someone from the lineage of one of the victims." A shiver ran down her spine as the realization hit her. Her grandmother had bought Mary's house and mirror. It was no coincidence. The mirror had chosen her family, waiting patiently for the right moment. The temperature in the attic continued to drop, and now their breaths formed little clouds in the air. In the reflections, Mary's images multiplied infinitely, some crying, others laughing, all coming closer and closer to the surface of the mirrors, as if they were trying to cross them. "Sarah," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, "look at Mrs. Peters." The old woman's body began to transform, her skin acquiring an unearthly pallor. Her eyes, when they opened, were completely black. When she spoke, it was no longer her voice. "You don't understand," Mary's voice said through her. "It's not just about my Thomas. There are so many others, so many lost souls. We need to set them free." "Free them or imprison them?" Sarah challenged, holding up the diary like a shield. "The mirror doesn't free anyone. It only consumes." A supernatural wind swept through the attic, causing the pages of the grimoire on the table to turn furiously. The flames of the candles danced violently, casting shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Emily, who had approached the grimoire, began to read aloud. "The mirror feeds on pain and loss. The stronger the desire for reunion, the more powerful it becomes. Mary wasn't its first victim. She was just another in a long line of desperate souls." Sarah felt something tug at her mind, like a distant call. Images began to flow into her consciousness. Her grandmother, young and frightened, staring into the same mirror, generations of women before her, all lured by the promise of reunion with lost loved ones. "We need to act now," Sarah decided, her voice finding strength. "If we wait until midnight, the mirror will be at its most powerful. But the ritual, Emily began to protest. "We can't follow his rules," Sarah interrupted. "That's how he manipulates us. We need to do something unexpected." At that moment, Mrs. Peters/Mary stood up, her body moving unnaturally. "You can't interfere. The cycle must be completed." The surfaces of the mirrors began to ripple like liquid mercury, and spectral hands emerged from them, trying to reach the girls. The air became thick with an ancient, malevolent energy. Sarah looked at the diary in her hands, then at Emily, and finally at the original mirror in her own attic, visible through the window of the neighboring house. An idea began to form in her mind, a dangerous one, but perhaps her only chance. "Emily," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I need you to trust me. When I tell you run to my house and get the mirror from the attic, bring it here." "But Sarah, it's the only way. If we can gather all the mirrors, including the original one, maybe we can overload the ritual, force it to self-destruct." The shadows around them intensified, and Mary's voice echoed throughout the attic. "You can't stop what's already in motion. The veil is opening, and all those who were lost will return." Sarah watched the reflections twist and turn, each surface showing a different aspect of the shadowy world beyond the glass. In some, she saw familiar faces, people who had disappeared over the years, all trapped in a limbo between worlds. "Now, Emily," Sarah shouted, pushing her friend towards the door as she herself faced the possessed figure of Mrs. Peters. Chaos ensued in the attic. The mirrors vibrated with deafening frequency, their surfaces continually cracking and reconstituting themselves. The dark mist emanating from Mrs. Peters began to take on more defined forms, silhouettes of all the mirror's victims over the centuries. Sarah held Mary's diary tightly, its pages now glowing with a light of their own, as if the words written so long ago were awakening. She began to recite the counter-ritual, but not as Mary had written it. She reversed it, turning the words of invocation into an incantation of banishment. Time seemed to distort as she waited for Emily to return. Each second dragged on like hours, and the shadows around her grew denser and more threatening. The power of the mirror was growing, fueled by the approach of midnight. The battle for the salvation of the trapped souls was about to reach its climax, and Sarah knew that the next decisions would determine not only her fate, but that of all those who had been captured by the dark reflection over the years. The real test of her courage and determination was just beginning. Time seemed to compress and expand as Sarah held her position, reciting the inverted words of the ritual. The mist around her became denser and denser, and the voices of the trapped spirits echoed in a supernatural cacophony. Emily burst into the attic, carrying the original mirror with difficulty. Her face was pale and sweaty. "Sarah, there's something wrong. The mirror, it's pulsating." Indeed, the surface of the mirror was emitting a reddish, pulsating glow like an evil heart. When Emily positioned it next to the other mirrors in the attic, a wave of energy ran through all of them, making them vibrate in unison. "Fools!" Mary's voice thundered through Mrs. Peters. "You have just completed the circle. The portal is now complete." Sarah realized her mistake too late. By bringing in the original mirror, they had inadvertently strengthened the connection between the worlds. The mirrored surfaces began to melt like wax, their shapes merging into a single gigantic portal. "Emily, the grimoire!" Sarah shouted, still holding the journal. "There must be something we can use." As Emily frantically flipped through the old pages, Sarah noticed something in Mary's notes that she hadn't seen before. Among the smudges and scribbles, there was a pattern, a repeating symbol, always drawn with what looked like dry blood. "The blood is the key," Sarah murmured, understanding. "It's not about destroying the mirrors. It's about breaking the bond." Mrs. Peters' figure began to twitch unnaturally, her body arching at impossible angles. The mist that enveloped her took the definitive form of Mary Sullivan, but not as the desperate woman who had disappeared decades ago. This was a corrupted version, her black eyes like bottomless pits, in her white dress stained dark red. So many years, the apparition spoke, her voice reverberating throughout the attic, so many souls collected. And now, finally, the ritual can be completed. The clock began to chime, announcing the approach of midnight. Each chime made the mirrors pulse more strongly, and spectral figures began to emerge from the liquid surfaces, all the victims of the mirror over the centuries. Sarah looked at Emily, who still held the grimoire, and then at the diary in her own hands. In a moment of clarity, she understood what needed to be done. "Emily," she called out, her voice firm despite her fear. "Remember when we were children and we made that blood pact? We need to do it again. Now." Emily understood immediately. Together, they cut their palms with a piece of broken glass, their blood mixing. Sarah began to recite the counter-ritual again, but this time, Emily joined her, their voices intertwining in perfect harmony. The girl's blood dripped onto the pages of the diary and the grimoire, and something extraordinary happened. The written words began to glow with a golden light, and a wave of pure energy emanated from the books, colliding with the spectral mist. Mary screamed, a sound that didn't belong in this world. "No, what have you done?" "We broke the circle," Sarah replied, feeling an ancient force flow through her. Not with hatred or revenge, but with love and sacrifice. The portal began to destabilize, the mirrors cracking one after the other. The trapped souls began to free themselves, no longer corrupted by the evil power of the mirror, but purified by the girl's blood sacrifice. Mary's spectral form began to change, the darkness in her eyes giving way to a light of understanding. For a moment, Sarah saw the woman she had really been, a mother devastated by loss, manipulated by an ancient force that fed on her pain. "Thomas," Mary called out, her voice now soft and clear. A small luminous figure emerged from the fragments of the mirrors, the spirit of her son, finally free from his spectral prison. "Mama," the child's voice echoed through the attic, and Mary stretched out her arms, tears of joy streaming down her ethereal face. The final stroke of midnight rang out as mother and child were reunited in a luminous embrace. A wave of golden light exploded from the point of contact, sweeping through the attic and shattering all the mirrors simultaneously. Sarah and Emily hugged each other, shielding themselves from the rain of broken glass. When the light dimmed, they found Mrs. Peters unconscious but breathing normally. The mirrors were shattered, their surfaces reduced to glittering dust that floated in the air like tiny stars. On the floor, among the shards, Mary's diary and the grimoire had turned to ash, their function fulfilled. The cycle of horror that had lasted for generations was finally broken. In the days that followed, Sarah and Emily discovered that all the old mirrors in the city had shattered that night. People reported visions of golden lights and feelings of inexplicable peace. Gradually, the stories of the mysterious disappearances were forgotten, like nightmares that fade with the sunrise. Mrs. Peters didn't remember what had happened, but her face carried a serenity that hadn't been there before. As for the attic of Sarah's house, it had been transformed into an ordinary room, full of light and free of the shadows that had inhabited it for so long. The girls kept their secret, but the small scars on their palms remained as a reminder of the power of sacrifice and true friendship. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, they swore they saw golden reflections in the corner of their eyes. No longer a sign of terror, but a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, the light of love and courage can find its way through. And somewhere, beyond the veil between the worlds, a mother and her son finally found the peace they had sought for so long, free from the spectral chains that had kept them trapped in a dark reflection for generations. The scorching sun of ancient Babylon beat down on the clay streets of the city of Sippar as Adad Bani, a young scribe of only 17, walked hurriedly towards the temple of Shamash. His ink-stained fingers firmly gripped a freshly engraved clay tablet, still damp from the morning's work. The young man had been chosen to document one of the most important moments in the kingdom's history, the arrival of the divine laws to King Hammurabi. His leather sandals thudded against the dusty ground as he dodged merchants, running children, and wagons laden with goods. The temple of Shamash rose majestically in front of him, its baked brick walls gleaming in the intense midday light. Adad-Bani knew that his position as the temple's chief scribe was a rare privilege for someone so young, but it also carried an immense responsibility. Inside the temple, the high priest No-Sin, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes and a neatly trimmed gray beard, was waiting anxiously. "Did you bring the records of the last vision?" he asked, his voice echoing through the sacred corridors. Adad-Bani nodded, carefully handing the tablet to the priest. "King Hammurabi had another dream tonight," murmured No-Sin, as his eyes traveled over the cuneiform characters engraved in the clay. Shamash appeared to him again, bringing further instructions on the laws that should govern our people. The young scribe felt a shiver run down his spine. In recent months, the king had reported increasingly frequent visions of the sun god, who was supposedly instructing him on how to create a fair and balanced code of laws. However, something in No-Sin's gaze aroused concern in Adad-Bani. In the midst of his reflections, a commotion began to form in the temple courtyard. A young woman in simple, dusty clothes ran through the gates, pursued by 2 guards. "Please," she cried, "I need justice. My brother was killed, and the murderer remains free." No-Sin gestured for the guards to stop. The woman, who introduced herself as Inanna, recounted in sobs how her brother, a small shopkeeper, had been murdered by a nobleman during a dispute over debts. "The authorities do nothing," she explained. "They say that the word of a nobleman is worth more than that of a dozen merchants." Adad-Bani watched attentively as No-Sin consoled the woman, promising to bring her case to the attention of the king. When she left, the high priest turned to the young scribe with a grave expression. "Now, but you see why these laws are so important? The people are crying out for justice. But how do we balance the power of the nobles with the rights of the lowly?" That night, while working by the light of an oil lamp in his temple chambers, Adad-Bani couldn't get the image of the desperate woman out of his head. On his work table, several clay tablets were waiting to receive the words that would document the creation of the Code of Laws. But something was bothering him. Among the records he kept, there were notes about cases similar to Inanna's. Ordinary people seeking justice against the powerful and not finding it. The young scribe began to notice a disturbing pattern in the visions reported by the king. They always seemed to favor the interests of the nobility, even when Hammurabi insisted that the laws would protect the weakest. A sudden noise made him look up from his work. No-Sin was standing outside his chambers, watching him with an expression that was impossible to decipher. "You have doubts, don't you?" asked the priest, entering the small room. "I see it in your eyes when you record the king's visions." Adad-Bani hesitated, aware of the danger of questioning the king's word, or worse, the divine will. But something in No-Sin's tone of voice encouraged him. "The laws, do they really come from Shamash?" he asked in a whisper. The high priest closed the door behind him and sat down next to the young scribe. "What do you think would happen if the people knew that laws were only the creation of men?" His voice was just a whisper. "How can they be respected without divine authority behind them?" That night's conversation would mark the beginning of a journey that would change Adad-Bani's life forever. In the days that followed, he continued his documentation work, but now with a new understanding of the complexity behind the creation of laws. He carefully observed the negotiations between priests and nobles, the discussions about punishments and compensation, and above all, the delicate balance between divine justice and earthly power. Inanna's case was not unique. Every day, people from all walks of life came to the temple in search of justice. Adad-Bani began to realize that his role as a scribe went beyond simple registration. He was documenting the birth of something revolutionary, a code of laws that, regardless of their divine or human origin, could truly bring order and justice to the kingdom. As the moon rose in the Babylonian sky, the young scribe continued his work, carefully engraving each word on the clay tablets. The weight of responsibility in his hands was immense, but now he understood that he was participating in something greater than himself, greater even than King Hammurabi himself. He was helping to create a legacy that would span the centuries. The next morning, Adad-Bani was awoken by the intense noise coming from the temple courtyard. Groups of people were crowding around, excitedly discussing the rumors that King Hammurabi was about to announce new laws. The young scribe straightened his robes and went to his post, where a new pile of clay tablets awaited him. Nosen was already at his usual post, supervising the preparations for the morning rituals. His eyes met Adad-Bani's, and a silent understanding passed between them. The previous night's conversation was to remain a secret. The high priest discreetly approached the young scribe. "Today the king will come to the temple," whispered Nosen. "He has had another vision of Shamash, more powerful than the previous ones. We need to be prepared to record every word." Adad-Bani nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility even more acutely after his nightly conversation with the priest. As he prepared his writing instruments, the young man watched Inanna return to the temple. This time, she wasn't alone. Other people accompanied her, each with their own story of injustice to tell. A merchant who had his goods unjustly confiscated, a widow whose land was taken by a nobleman, a craftsman beaten for refusing to work without pay. Adad-Bani's heart squeezed at the sight of this procession of suffering. His hands worked mechanically, preparing the clay tablets, but his mind was focused on the stories he was hearing. How could these new laws really protect these people? Would the king's divine visions be enough to guarantee justice for all? Hammurabi's arrival at the temple was announced by the sound of trumpets. The king entered accompanied by his personal guard and a group of advisors. His eyes shone with an almost feverish intensity, and his posture emanated an authority that seemed more than earthly. Adad-Bani positioned himself strategically, ready to record every word. "Shamash has come to me again," Hammurabi proclaimed, his voice resounding through the temple. "The sun god has shown me how to protect the weak from the strong, how to establish order in our kingdom." The king began to dictate the new laws, and Adad-Bani's fingers flew over the clay, engraving each word with precision. As he worked, the young scribe noticed something interesting. Some of the laws that the king proclaimed as divine revelations were surprisingly similar to the complaints he had heard in the temple courtyard. A specific law on the protection of widows and orphans seemed to respond directly to Inanna's case. During a pause in the dictation, Adad-Bani noticed Nosen attentively observing the reaction of the people present. The high priest seemed to be assessing the impact of each new law on the different groups: nobles, merchants, craftsmen, and peasants. Their eyes met briefly, and Adad-Bani saw in them a mixture of concern and hope. The session continued until late afternoon. As the sun began to set, Hammurabi ended his proclamation with a solemn blessing. The people began to disperse, commenting animatedly on the new laws. Adad-Bani remained at his post, organizing the tablets he had filled in during the day. Nosen approached again, this time accompanied by a man Adad-Bani didn't know. "This is Marduk Nasir," introduced the priest. "He's one of the king's closest advisors." The advisor examined the tablets with interest, his experienced eyes assessing the accuracy of the records. "You have a rare gift, young scribe," commented Marduk Nasir. "Your writing is clear and precise, but there is something more. You capture not only the words, but also their deeper meaning." Adad-Bani thanked him for the compliment, but couldn't help noticing the exchange of glances between the advisor and Nosen. That evening, while copying the day's records on a permanent tablets, Adad-Bani reflected on everything he had witnessed. The laws he was helping to document really did seem to seek a balance between the different strata of society. But how much of this justice really came from divine visions, and how much was the result of human wisdom and political necessity? A movement at the entrance to his chambers caught his attention. It was Inanna, accompanied by Nosen. "The king has ordered that your case be reviewed," announced the priest. "The new laws establish clear punishments for crimes like the one that killed your brother, regardless of the criminal's social position." Inanna's face lit up with hope, and Adad-Bani felt something change inside him. Perhaps it didn't matter so much whether the laws came directly from Shamash or were the result of human wisdom and need. What mattered was their power to bring justice and order, to protect the weak and regulate the actions of the powerful. As night fell over Babylon, the young scribe continued his work, engraving on the tablets not only the words of the laws, but also the stories of the people they would affect. In his heart, he began to understand that he was taking part in something truly revolutionary. the creation of a code that would forever transform the way societies understood and applied justice. As the days passed, news of the trial of Inanna's case spread quickly through the city. Bani watched as people commented on the new laws and their implications, especially the fact that even nobles could be punished for their crimes. The young scribe continued his meticulous work in the temple, but now with a closer eye on the changes that were beginning to take place in Babylonian society. One morning, while organizing the latest tablets, Marduk-Nasir appeared in the temple again, this time with a worried expression. "The king wants you to record something special," he said to Bani. "There has been resistance from some nobles to the new laws." Hammurabi had another vision of Shamash, one that reinforces the divine authority of the code. While preparing the materials for the new registration session, Bani noticed an unusual commotion in the temple corridors. Groups of priests were talking in whispers, and extra guards were stationed at the entrances. Nosen approached him with hurried steps. "Be careful today," muttered the high priest. "There's a lot at stake. Some powerful families are questioning not only the laws, but the very authority of the king to establish them." The young scribe nodded, understanding the delicacy of the situation. The king arrived at the temple accompanied by a larger than usual escort. His face showed signs of fatigue, but his eyes maintained that intense glow that Bani already knew well. Before the dictation of the new revelations began, Hammurabi summoned Inanna to stand before everyone. "Let everyone see how Shamash guides our justice," proclaimed the king. "The nobleman who murdered your brother has been tried and found guilty. His punishment will be the same as that meted out to any other murderer, regardless of his social position." A murmur went through the crowd. While recording the king's words, Bani noticed suspicious movements among some of the nobles present. They exchanged meaningful glances and whispers that didn't sound like approval. The young scribe noticed that Marduk-Nasir was attentively observing these reactions, making discreet signals to the guards. As the day progressed, Hammurabi continued to dictate new laws and interpretations, increasingly specific about how they should be applied. Bani worked tirelessly, his skillful hands transforming the king's words into permanent records in clay. During a pause, Nosen approached the young scribe again. "Do you realize what's happening?" he whispered. "The king is using divine authority to consolidate the laws, but he is also responding to the real needs of the people. It's a delicate balance." In the afternoon, an incident disrupted the session. An elderly nobleman, known for his influence in the city, stood up abruptly. "How can we be sure that these are really the words of Shamash?" he wondered aloud. "Why would the sun god choose to protect merchants and craftsmen above those who have always ruled?" The silence that followed was tense. Hammurabi rose slowly from his seat, his figure casting a long shadow on the temple floor. "You question not only my word, but the divine will?" His voice was calm, but laden with authority. Bani watched in fascination as the king walked up to one of the temple's large windows, where the rays of the setting sun entered directly. "Look," exclaimed Hammurabi. "Shamash is enlightening us right now with his presence. The laws he brings us do not distinguish between noble and common, for before the gods, we must all answer for our actions." The moment was so dramatic that the young scribe almost dropped his stylus. Nosen, who was standing nearby, let out a small smile of approval. The nobleman who had questioned the laws stepped back, visibly intimidated by the king's show of authority. That evening, after everyone had left, Bani remained in the temple, copying down the day's records. Marduk-Nasir joined him, carrying an extra lab. "Do you understand now why we need divine authority?" asked the advisor. "Laws may be just and necessary, but it is the belief in their sacred origin that guarantees their acceptance." The young scribe reflected on the advisor's words as he continued his work. The tablets in his hands contained more than just rules and punishments. They were a reflection of the complex web of power, faith, and necessity that held society together. A movement caught his eye. It was Inanna, who had remained in the temple after the pronouncement on her case. She timidly approached his desk. "Will the words you record," she said, "bring justice to others like my brother?" Bani looked at the clay tablets, at his ink-stained hands, and then at the woman's hopeful face. "These laws," she answered carefully, "whether they come directly from Shamash or are inspired by his wisdom through the king, exist to protect people like you and your brother." As the night wore on, the young scribe continued his work, increasingly aware of the importance of his role. He was not just a recorder of laws, but a keeper of the memory of how justice was being transformed in his time. In the days that followed, the tension in the temple remained palpable. Adad-Bani noticed a significant increase in the number of guards, and conversations between the priests were increasingly reserved. Inanna's case had become a symbol of the change that the new laws promised, but it had also aroused resistance among those who saw their privileges threatened. One morning, while working on his boards, Adad-Bani noticed an unusual movement. A group of merchants had arrived from a distant city, bringing disturbing news. Other kingdoms were beginning to question Hammurabi's authority and his divinely inspired laws. "The neighboring kings are afraid that their own people will demand similar laws," explained Marduk Nasir, who had joined Adad-Bani at his desk. "They say that no mortal should have the power to establish such sweeping laws, even if he claims divine inspiration." The young scribe continued his work, but his hands trembled slightly as he recorded the new decrees. The implications of the news were worrying. If other kingdoms opposed Hammurabi's laws, it could mean conflict, perhaps even war. Nosen appeared in the late afternoon, his face marked by concern. "The king has called a special assembly for tomorrow," he announced. "All the nobles, priests, and representatives of the main classes must be present. Adad-Bani, you will need to record every word even more carefully than usual." That night, the young scribe could hardly sleep. His thoughts were divided between the greatness of what he was helping to create and the dangers this creation faced. Through his small window, he watched the stars over Babylon, wondering if Shamash would really approve of everything that was being done in his name. The assembly began at dawn. The great hall of the temple was packed with representatives from all walks of life. Adad-Bani took his usual place, preparing his clay tablets. He observed Inanna among the crowd. She now occupied a prominent place as a living example of the justice of the new laws. Hammurabi entered the hall with even greater solemnity than usual. His royal robe glittered with gold details, and his posture was that of someone who carried the weight not just of a kingdom, but of a divine mission. "Shamash has shown me in a new vision," the king began, his voice echoing through the hall, "that our laws must extend beyond the borders of our city. The sun god wants all peoples to know true justice." While recording the king's words, Adad-Bani noticed different reactions among those present. Some nobles clearly looked uncomfortable, while merchants and craftsmen showed approval. Nosen maintained a neutral expression, but his attentive eyes didn't miss a single detail. The king continued his speech, detailing how the laws would be applied in conquered or allied territories. He spoke about the need for trained scribes to copy and disseminate the code, and about how the temples of Shamash and other cities would serve as centers for the administration of justice. During a pause, Marduk Nasir discreetly approached Adad-Bani. "The king is playing a dangerous game," he whispered. "Using divine authority to expand political power is like walking on a knife." The young scribe nodded, understanding more and more the complex layers of meaning behind each law he recorded. It wasn't just about justice or social order. It was about power, legitimacy, and the delicate relationship between the divine and the earthly. The assembly continued until late afternoon, with different speakers taking turns to express support or concerns about the king's plans. Adad-Bani meticulously recorded everything, his tireless hands transforming words into history engraved in clay. As the sun began to set, a dramatic moment captured everyone's attention. A ray of light came through one of the temple's tall windows, shining directly on where Hammurabi was sitting. The king stood up, bathed in golden light. "Look," exclaimed one of the priests. "Shamash himself blesses our king and his laws." Adad-Bani watched the scene with fascination, but also noticed a subtle smile on Nosen's lips. The high priest had commented earlier on the importance of understanding how the sun moved through the temple windows throughout the day. After the assembly, while organizing his tablets, the young scribe was surprised by an unexpected visitor. It was the nobleman who had questioned the laws a few days earlier. His face was marked by a different expression now, no longer one of defiance, but of resignation mixed with curiosity. "Young scribe," he said quietly, "you who record these laws, do you truly believe that they come from the gods?" Adebani hesitated, carefully weighing his words. "I believe," he finally replied, "that true justice pleases the gods, regardless of its origin." The nobleman studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Perhaps you're right," he murmured, turning away thoughtfully. That night, working by the light of his lamp, Adebani reflected on how the laws he was helping to record were changing not only society, but also the way people thought about justice, authority, and social order. Each tablet he completed was more than just a record. It was a brick in the construction of something truly revolutionary. As the new laws spread throughout the kingdom, Adebani noticed subtle but significant changes in Babylonian daily life. The flow of people seeking justice at the temple increased daily, and the young scribe noticed that they came not only from the city, but also from distant regions, attracted by the fame of Hammurabi's code. One particularly busy morning, while organizing his tablets, Adebani was surprised by an unusual group. They were scribes from other temples, sent to learn the new code of laws. The king had ordered that copies be distributed throughout the kingdom, and Adebani was assigned to train the new recorders. "You must teach them not only to copy the words, Sin instructed, but also to understand their deeper meaning. These laws will only work if those who record them truly understand their purpose." Among the visiting scribes was a young woman called Ninsan, something rare for the time. Her bright, attentive eyes reminded Adebani of his own enthusiasm when he began his work at the temple. During the training sessions, she often asked insightful questions about the origin and purpose of the laws. "How can we be sure that we are interpreting Shamash's will correctly?" she asked one day, as they practiced recording a particularly complex case about property rights. Before Adebani could answer, Marduk Nasir, who was supervising the training, intervened. "True wisdom," he said, "lies in recognizing that divine justice manifests itself through human understanding of the needs of our people." Working with the new scribes brought a new perspective for Adebani. Each time he explained a law or its context, he better understood the complexity of what they had created. The stories of Inanna and others who had found justice through the code served as powerful examples for the apprentices. One day, while supervising the work of the scribes, Adebani noticed an unusual commotion in the temple courtyard. Hammurabi had returned from a successful military campaign, bringing news that other kingdoms had agreed to adopt parts of the code of laws. "This is a victory greater than any military achievement," commented Narrated, watching the scribes at work. "Our laws are changing not only our city, but the entire known world." The expansion of the code brought new challenges. Different cultures and traditions needed to be considered, and Adebani often found himself working with Marduk Nasir and other advisors to adapt the interpretations of the laws to different contexts. During this period, Inanna became a regular presence in the temple, helping to guide others who sought justice. Her story had become a symbol of hope, and she now worked actively to ensure that the new laws were applied fairly. "You see," she told Adebani one day, "it doesn't matter whether these laws came directly from Shamash or through the king's wisdom. What matters is that they are changing lives." The young scribe agreed, remembering his own journey of discovery. From initial doubts about the divine origin of the laws to understanding their true meaning and impact. One afternoon, while working on his copies, Adebani received an unexpected visitor. It was the nobleman who had murdered Inanna's brother, now serving his punishment through work and compensation to the family. "I've come to thank you," said the nobleman, surprising the scribe. "These laws, they made me see that no one is above justice, not even us, the privileged." That moment crystallized something that Adebani had been realizing throughout his journey. Laws were not just a set of rules to be followed, but an instrument of social transformation that affected everyone, from the humblest to the most powerful. The work continued, and with it came new responsibilities. Hammurabi entrusted Adebani with the task of creating a special compendium of the laws, including not only the decrees, but also examples of their application and the fundamental principles that guided them. This will be his legacy, said Nurse Sin, watching the young scribe work on the special tablets. Long after we are all gone, these words will continue to guide people in their search for justice. As he completed his work on the compendium, Ad-Ad-Bani reflected on his own transformation. From a young scribe full of doubts, he had become not just a recorder of laws, but a guardian of something much greater. The idea that justice could be codified, understood, and applied universally. One evening, while finishing the last tablet of the compendium, Ad-Ad-Bani found Nin-san working alone in the temple. "Why do you choose to become a scribe?" she asked. "At first, I just wanted to record history," he replied after a moment's reflection. "But I've learned that sometimes by recording history, we help to create it." The sun set over Babylon, casting long shadows through the temple windows. Ad-Ad-Bani looked at his completed tablets, each containing not only laws, but also the stories of the people who had helped shape them. Hammurabi's code had become much more than a set of divinely inspired rules. It was a testament to the human capacity to seek and create justice. And so, in the ancient clay streets of Babylon, a silent revolution had taken place, engraved for eternity on clay tablets by a young scribe who learned that true justice is born from the harmony between the divine and the human, between authority and compassion, between tradition and change. The sun was setting over the Egyptian horizon, tinting the sky with golden and crimson hues as the mighty god Ra prepared for his nocturnal journey through the underworld. In his majestic solar boat, decorated with ancient hieroglyphics and sacred symbols, the god gazed out over the dark waters that stretched out before him. His eyes, which during the day illuminated the entire world of the living, were now focused on the darkness that was beginning to envelop his vessel. Batet, the feline goddess of protection, was on board, her green eyes sparkling with a keen vigilance. Her slender, graceful body moved silently across the bow of the boat, while her pointed ears picked up every whisper in the shadows. Beside her, Sekhmet, the mighty lioness goddess of war, emanated an aura of brutal strength, her golden eyes burning like embers in the growing dimness. "I can smell her," whispered Batet, her nostrils flaring. "Apophis is near tonight." Ari nodded gravely, his golden scepter glowing with a light of its own as the last shreds of natural light disappeared over the horizon. The sun god knew that, as on every night since the beginning of time, the serpent of chaos would try to prevent his passage and, consequently, the dawning of the new day. The waters of the underworld were different from the waters of the Nile that mortals knew. Here, every wave carried memories of lost souls. Every current whispered ancient secrets. The darkness was not just an absence of light, but a living entity that moved and breathed, trying to swallow up the solar boat and its divine occupants. Sekhmet wielded her spear, the divine metal reflecting the supernatural radiance of Ra. "She's more restless today," observed the warrior goddess, her deep voice reverberating through the heavy air of the underworld. "I can feel her growing hunger." The divine oarsmen, blessed spirits who assisted in the night's journey, kept up a steady pace, their paddles cutting through the black waters with supernatural precision. The boat glided through ancient caves, passing pillars covered in phosphorescent moss that illuminated the path with a spectral glow. It was then that the waters began to stir. At first, they were just small ripples, but soon they turned into violent whirlpools. Beneath the surface, a dark, sinuous mass began to take shape. Apophis, the primordial serpent of chaos, was emerging from the depths. "Get ready," cried Ra, his divine body radiating a more intense golden glow. The oarsmen redoubled their efforts, while Badet and Sekhmet took up battle positions. The monstrous head of Apophis broke the surface of the water, its black scales absorbing all the light around it. His eyes, filled with pure emptiness, stared at the solar bow with a hatred as old as the universe itself. Its jaw opened, revealing endless rows of dagger-sharp teeth. "Once again we meet, Ra," hissed Apophis, his voice a cacophony of thousands of snakes whispering simultaneously, as it has been every night since the beginning, and as it will be until the end of time. Ra remained impassive, although his glow intensified, and as on every night, Apophis, you will be defeated. Order must prevail over chaos. The serpent laughed, a sound that made the very waters of the underworld shudder. Order is an illusion. Chaos is the natural state of all things. I am the truth you try to deny. Batet moved like lightning, her divine claws slicing through the air as she leapt towards the monster. Sekhmet, for her part, brandished her spear with devastating force, aiming for the serpent's eyes. Apophis dodged with surprising agility for his colossal size, his immense body snaking around the solar boat. The waters of the underworld were churning violently now, threatening to capsize the boat. The oarsmen struggled to stay on course, their ethereal faces contorted with a supernatural effort. Ra raised a scepter, and a beam of golden light cut through the darkness, striking Apophis and making the serpent roar with pain and fury. You cannot truly destroy me, cried Apophis, his body writhing in agony. I'm as fundamental to existence as you are, Ra. Without me, without the chaos I represent, your order would have no meaning. We do not seek your destruction, replied Ra, his voice reverberating with divine power. But we will not allow you to impede the natural cycle of life. The sun must rise, and it will. The battle continued to rage in the depths of the underworld, a deadly dance between light and darkness, order and chaos. Batet and Sekhmet moved in perfect synchronicity, their divine abilities complementing each other as they faced the ancient threat. Every onslaught from Apophis was answered with equal or greater force. Every attempt to destroy the solar boat was thwarted by the unwavering determination of its defenders. And so, as had happened countless times before, and as would continue to happen for all eternity, the battle for the survival of the cosmic order raged in the mystical depths of the Egyptian underworld. The fate of the living world hung by a thread, sustained only by the courage and determination of Ra and his divine guardians. While the night was still far from over, the battle continued with increasing intensity as Apophis circled the solar boat with ever more aggressive movements. His black scales scraped against the boat's hull, producing a shrill sound that echoed through the underworld. Batet, with her feline agility, leapt between the tumultuous waves, her divine claws leaving luminous trails in the air as she attacked the serpent of chaos. Sekhmet, taking advantage of a momentary breach in Apophis' defense, drove his golden spear deep into the serpent's scales. The ensuing roar of pain made the very walls of the underworld tremble, and a shower of ancient rocks began to fall from the surrounding caverns. The divine oarsman had to maneuver deftly to avoid the debris that threatened to crush the vessel. Her tactics are changing, observed Batet, her vertical pupils dilated in the darkness. She's never attacked with such ferocity before. Ra, still maintaining his regal posture at the bow of the boat, realized the truth in the feline goddess's words. Over the millennia, he had faced Apophis countless times, but something was different tonight. The serpent of chaos seemed more determined, more desperate in its attempt to prevent the passage of the solar boat. The balance is shifting, hissed Apophis, his immense body writhing in hypnotic patterns. The mortals above are beginning to embrace chaos. Their temples fall into ruin, their offerings dwindle. Your influence wanes, Ra, while mine grows. The serpent's words carried a disturbing weight. It was true that the world of mortals was changing. New peoples with their own gods and beliefs were beginning to influence the lands of Egypt. The power of the old gods, although still formidable, was no longer as absolute as before. Sekhmet roared in defiance, the sound echoing through the caverns of the underworld. As long as there is a single soul who believes in order, we will keep fighting. The dark waters of the underworld began to bubble with evil energy. From within, shadows began to take shape, physical manifestations of the chaos that Apophis commanded. They were shapeless creatures, neither completely solid nor totally ethereal. moving towards the solar boat with clearly hostile intentions. "Protect the rowers," ordered Ra, his scepter shining with redoubled intensity. The blessed spirits who moved the boat were essential to completing the night's journey, and their loss would mean the end of everything. Bartet moved like lightning, his claws slicing through the shadows with lethal precision. Her every blow dispersed the creatures into dark mist, but for every one she destroyed, two more seemed to emerge from the depths. Sekhmet, meanwhile, used her spear as a staff of light, creating a defensive perimeter around the boat. Apophis took advantage of the defender's distraction to launch his most daring attack yet. His huge body plunged under the boat, emerging from the other side with enough force to almost capsize the vessel. Ra was forced to use his powers to stabilize the boat, but this left him momentarily vulnerable. "Now you're mine," triumphed Apophis, his gaping jaw aimed directly at the solar god. It was at this critical moment that something unexpected happened. From the shadows of the underworld, an ancient chant began to echo, the prayers of mortals who still kept the faith. It was a faint sound at first, but it grew in intensity, carrying with it the strength of human belief. Ra felt his power renewed by the prayers, his divine body glowing with an intensity that made even Apophis recoil. "You are wrong, serpent," declared the sun god. "As long as there are those who seek the light, who yearn for order in chaos, our power will remain." The song of the mortals continued to echo through the underworld, strengthening not only Ra, but also Bartet and Sekhmet. The warrior goddesses now moved with renewed vigor, their actions perfectly synchronized as they fought both Apophis and his dark creatures. The waters of the underworld began to clear slightly, indicating that the night's journey was approaching its midpoint. Apophis, realizing that his window of opportunity was closing, gathered his strength for one last desperate attack. "You may have won this battle," hissed the serpent, "but the war is far from over. The world is changing, Ra, and not even you can stop it." With a sudden movement, Apophis plunged into the depths, taking his dark creatures with him. The waters of the underworld gradually calmed down, although everyone on board the solar boat knew that the peace was only temporary. "She's right about one thing," said Bardet, wiping her claws as she watched the dark waters. "The world is changing." Sekhmet leaned on her spear, her golden eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Change doesn't necessarily mean destruction. Sometimes adaptation is necessary to maintain order." Ra remained silent for a moment, contemplating the words of his warriors. The solar boat continued its journey through the underworld, but the god realized that this night had been different from the others. Something fundamental was really changing, not only in the world of mortals, but also in the very fabric of reality. The rowers kept up their steady pace, their paddles cutting through the now calmer waters of the underworld. The phosphorescent glow of the ancient caves continued to guide their way, but the shadows seemed deeper, more threatening than before. Tonight's battle was over, but everyone knew that it was just one chapter in a much bigger story. A story that continued to unfold, night after night, in an eternal dance between order and chaos, light and darkness. As the solar boat continued its journey through the underworld, the silence that followed the battle was fraught with tension. The sacred hieroglyphs on the boat's hull pulsed gently, reacting to the mystical energies that permeated the air. Ra watched the dark waters intently, knowing that the apparent calm was only an illusion. "Apophis' words disturb me," Bardet confessed, moving gracefully closer to Ra. "I feel the changes in the prayers of mortals. They are no longer as focused as before." Sekhmet, still standing guard, nodded gravely. The temples that once echoed with chants are now quieter. New gods arrive with the foreigners, bringing with them different forms of order and chaos. Ra raised his scepter, illuminating the cavernous walls of the underworld. Ancient symbols and long-forgotten prophecies glowed momentarily in his divine light. Change is part of existence, reflected the sun god. Even we divine beings are not immune to it. The rowers continued their tireless work, but their movements seemed heavier, as if the very air of the underworld was becoming denser. The waters began to murmur ancient secrets, stories of ages past when other gods had appeared and disappeared. Suddenly, a strange vibration ran through the boat. It wasn't the familiar movement of Apophis approaching, but something different, more subtle and equally disturbing. The surrounding waters began to form images, reflections of the mortal world above. "Look," whispered Bartet, her feline eyes capturing every detail of the aquatic visions. "The mortals are changing their ways. In the waters, they could see temples being transformed, statues being relocated, new symbols being carved alongside the old hieroglyphics. It was a gradual but undeniable transformation of the world they had known for millennia. That explains the renewed strength of Apophis," observed Sekhmet, her voice laden with concern. "It feeds not only on chaos, but also on uncertainty and change." Ra remained silent for a moment, his golden aura pulsing gently. "Perhaps it's time for a new strategy," he finally said. "We can't fight change, but we can guide it." The words had barely left his lips when a stronger tremor shook the boat. From the depths emerged not Apophis, but something equally disturbing. Fragments of pure chaos, physical manifestations of the very transformation that was taking place in the world above. "Form a circle," commanded Ra, as the fragments of chaos began to surround the boat. They were like pieces of floating black glass, each reflecting a different reality, an alternative possibility. Bartet and Sekhmet positioned themselves, but their usual methods of combat seemed less effective against this new type of threat. Bastet's claws passed through the fragments without causing any damage, while Sekhmet's spear only split them into smaller pieces. They can't be destroyed in the traditional way, Bartet realized, her pupils dilated with understanding. They are manifestations of change itself. Ra raised a scepter once more, but this time, instead of attacking, he began to chant an ancient song, older than Egypt itself. The words flowed in a language that preceded hieroglyphics, carrying a power that made the very waters of the underworld resound in harmony. The fragments of chaos began to react to the chant, their shapes shifting and realigning. Instead of threatening the boat, they began to form a pattern around it, a new kind of protection, born of the very change that had previously threatened them. "That's it," murmured Sekhmet, observing the phenomenon with wonder. "We can't fight transformation, but we can embrace it and direct it." The rowers, inspired by the demonstration of adaptability, found a new rhythm in their movements. The boat now glided through the waters with a different grace, embodying change rather than resisting it. It was then that a familiar laugh echoed through the underworld. Apophis had returned, but when the serpent emerged from the depths, it found something unexpected, a solar boat not only protected by brute force, but enveloped in an aura of controlled transformation. "Do you think you can use change to your advantage?" hissed Apophis, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and curiosity. "Change is chaos, and chaos is my domain." "You're wrong again," replied Ra, his voice carrying a new quality of power. "Change is neither order nor chaos. It is the path between the two, and we have learned to walk that path." The fragments of chaos that now protected the boat began to glow with a light of their own, reflecting not only Ra's power, but also the adaptive strength of everyone on board. It was a demonstration of how even the most chaotic elements could be harmonized when truly understood. Apophis launched into a new attack, but this time met with a different kind of resistance. His every onslaught was not only blocked, but redirected, transformed into something that further strengthened the solar boat's protection. "The night isn't over yet," Bartet reminded us, her claws now leaving trails of light that mingled with the fragments of controlled chaos. "And we have a lot to learn about this new balance." The solar boat continued its journey through the underworld, now not only fighting the forces of chaos, but learning to incorporate and transform the very nature of change. It was a new chapter in the eternal battle, a necessary evolution to maintain cosmic order in a world in constant transformation. As the night in the underworld progressed, the transformation of the solar boat and its occupants continued to manifest itself in surprising ways. The fragments of chaos that now served as a protective shield emitted an oscillating glow, creating patterns that resembled constellations in constant movement. Apophis circled the vessel with growing frustration, his colossal form casting distorted shadows on the walls of the underworld. Each attempted attack was not only neutralized, but transformed into energy that further strengthened the boat's protection. "You may have learned a few new tricks," hissed the serpent, its black scales glistening with a sickly glow, "but the true power of chaos has not yet fully revealed itself." R.A. stood firm in his position, his scepter now pulsing in sync with the fragments of controlled chaos. "Power lies not in resisting change, Apophis, but in understanding and guiding it." Baudet, who was attentively observing the patterns formed by the fragments, noticed something intriguing. "The symbols," she murmured, her feline eyes picking up details imperceptible to the others. "They're turning into something new, something old and new at the same time." Sekhmet moved closer to take a closer look, her spear now emitting a glow that blended harmoniously with the boat's new protection. "They're like living hieroglyphics," observed the warrior goddess. "They tell a story that is being written as it happens." The rowers, still maintaining their steady rhythm, seemed to be more in tune with the waters of the underworld. Each movement of their paddles created ripples that interacted with the fragments of chaos, generating new patterns of light and energy. It was then that Apophis did something unexpected. Instead of attacking directly, the snake began to sing, an ancient sound that made the very waters of the underworld vibrate at disturbing frequencies. It was a chant that spoke of times before the gods, when chaos was the only reality that existed. "She's trying to awaken something," Baudet warned, her hair bristling in response to the ancient melody. "Something that has slept in the depths since the beginning of time." The waters around the boat began to stir in a different way, as if responding to Apophis' call. From the depths, forms even older than the serpent of chaos itself began to emerge, primordial manifestations of the disorder that preceded creation. R.A., recognizing the gravity of the situation, began his own chant, a harmony that intertwined with the disturbing sound of Apophis. It was a song of transformation and adaptation, which sought not to combat the primordial chaos, but to understand and redirect it. "The mortals above are feeling it," said Sekhmet, realizing how the conflicting energies affected the upper world. "Their dreams are filled with ancient visions, memories of a time before time." The fragments of chaos protecting the boat began to pulse more intensely, reacting to the musical battle that was taking place. Each note of Apophis' song tried to awaken more primordial chaos, while Ra's harmony worked to transform this energy into something constructive. Baudet, realizing her role in this new kind of conflict, began to move in an ancient ritual dance. Her feline movements created patterns in the air that intertwined with the fragments of chaos, adding a new dimension to the boat's protection. Sekhmet joined the dance, her more martial movements complementing Bastet's grace. The warrior goddess' spear left trails of light that formed symbols of power and protection, merging with the patterns already in place. The creatures that Apophis had awakened, amorphous forms of primordial chaos, began to circle the boat, but they encountered a defense unlike anything they had ever faced. Instead of being repelled, they were gradually transformed, their chaotic energies being redirected and integrated into the new pattern of protection. "You can't go on like this forever," teased Apophis, although there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Primordial chaos cannot be contained or transformed indefinitely." "We don't intend to contain it," replied R.A., his voice blending with the harmony he was creating. "We intend to learn from it, to evolve with it, just as the universe itself has done since the beginning." The rowers, inspired by the demonstration of adaptability, began to incorporate the new rhythms into their movements. The solar boat not only crossed the waters of the underworld, but seemed to dance through them, each movement part of a larger cosmic choreography. The walls of the underworld began to reflect the changing energies, creating a spectacle of light and shadow that told the story of creation itself. Not as a single event in the distant past, but as a continuous process of transformation and renewal. Sunrise is approaching, Bartet observed, feeling the energies of the upper world begin to change. But this night has taught us something we will never forget. Apophis, realizing that his strategy was not having the desired effect, prepared for one last, desperate attack. The creatures of primordial chaos she had awakened were beginning to merge with her colossal body, making her even more powerful and unpredictable. "If I can't stop the sunrise," declared the serpent, its form now even more monstrous and distorted, "I will make this last hour of the night unforgettable for all of you." The solar boat continued its journey through the turbulent waters of the underworld, its occupants now more prepared than ever to face any challenge Apophis might present. The battle was far from over, but it had turned into something very different from what anyone could have predicted earlier in the evening. The solar boat shuddered under the impact of Apophis' transformation. The serpent of chaos, now fused with primordial energies, was a terrifying sight even for the gods. Its serpentine body seemed to absorb light itself, creating a vacuum of darkness that threatened to swallow everything in its path. Ra, however, maintained his composure, this golden glow pulsing in harmony with the fragments of chaos that protected the vessel. "Even in this form," he said, his voice resonating with ancient wisdom, "you still do not understand the true nature of existence." Bartet and Sekhmet continued their ritual dance, their movements now perfectly synchronized with the ever-changing patterns surrounding the boat. The rowers, guided by an instinctive understanding of the new order that was being established, adjusted their rhythm to maintain the delicate balance between movement and transformation. "The true nature of existence is chaos," roared Apophis, launching into an attack that made the very walls of the underworld tremble. Waves of primordial energy emanated from his distorted body, threatening to destabilize the reality around him. But something unexpected happened when these waves hit the shield of chaotic fragments protecting the boat. Instead of causing destruction, they were absorbed and transformed, fueling a process of metamorphosis that no one, not even Ra, had predicted. "Watch closely, Apophis," said Bartet, her feline eyes shining with new understanding. "What you see is destruction. We transform into creation." The symbols dancing around the boat began to tell a story older than time itself. Not just about the eternal struggle between order and chaos, but about how both were necessary parts of a greater cycle of existence. Sekhmet, her spear now emitting a glow that blended perfectly with the transformed energies, realized something crucial. "It's not about winning or losing," she declared. "It's about finding harmony in apparent conflict." The waters of the underworld, which had previously seemed so hostile and threatening, began to reflect patterns of transcendental beauty. It was as if the underworld itself was awakening to a new form of consciousness, one that transcended the simple duality between light and darkness. Apophis, in his monstrous, distorted form, hesitated for a moment, his countless eyes observing the transformation with a mixture of anger and fascination. "You cannot change what I am," she hissed, although her voice betrayed a note of uncertainty. "We don't intend to change you," replied Ra, his scepter tracing complex patterns in the air. "Your existence is as necessary as ours. It is balance that we seek, not domination." The oarsmen, moving in perfect harmony with the transformed energies, guided the boat through currents of primordial power that now seemed more like rivers of infinite possibilities than obstacles to be overcome. Sunrise was near, its influence already beginning to be felt even in the depths of the underworld. But this wouldn't be just another transition from night to day. Something fundamental had changed during this journey. Apophis launched into one last desperate attack, his immense body contorting into impossible shapes as he tried to break the new order that was being established. But his every move was met not with resistance, but with acceptance and transformation. "You are part of this cosmic dance," said Bartet, her graceful movements weaving patterns of light through the darkness. "Always have been, always will be." The fragments of chaos that protected the boat began to pulsate with a light that was neither golden like Ra's nor black like Apophis. but something entirely new, a visual manifestation of the balance that was being achieved. The primordial creatures that Apophis had awakened began to quieten down, no longer responding to his call for destruction, but finding their own place in the new pattern that was emerging. It was as if the underworld itself was breathing in a new, more harmonious and integrated rhythm. "The sun will rise," declared R.A., his voice carrying not triumph but deep understanding, not as a victory over darkness, but as part of an eternal cycle of transformation. Apophis, his form beginning to stabilize, looked at the solar bow with eyes that reflected no longer just hatred, but also a glimmer of understanding. "So this is the true nature of existence," she murmured. "Not absolute chaos or order, but the eternal dance between the two." The solar bow continued its journey through the last hours of the night, but now was more than just a boat. It was a living symbol of transformation and balance. The oarsmen Batet, Sekhmet, and R.A. were no longer just defenders of order, but guardians of a new understanding. The waters of the underworld began to clear, not just with the approach of dawn, but with an inner light that spoke of infinite possibilities. The eternal battle between Apophis and R.A. had been transformed into something deeper and more meaningful, a cosmic dance of continuous transformation. And so, when the first ray of sunlight finally penetrated the depths of the underworld, it found not a battle in progress, but a celebration of existence itself in all its forms. The solar boat emerged for another day, carrying with it not only the light of the sun, but also the wisdom born of a night of profound transformation. The nocturnal journey was over, but learning would continue, night after night, in an eternal cycle of discovery and renewal. The underworld, Apophis, and all its inhabitants had become part of a greater story, not of conflict, but of evolution and mutual understanding.